Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Picture this. It's 1870 in Manchester, and Sarah Whitmore rocks her third child to sleep for the fourth time tonight. The baby won't stop crying. Her husband works 16-hour shifts at the cotton mill, and she's already lost 2 children to disease. Sarah reaches for a small brown bottle on the mantelpiece, the same bottle every mother on her street keeps within arm's reach. She measures out a careful spoonful of dark, sweet liquid and places it on the baby's tongue. Within minutes, blessed silence fills the cramped tenement room. What Sarah doesn't realize is that she's just given her infant a dose of morphine strong enough to sedate a grown man, and she's not alone. Across Victorian England, millions of mothers are unknowingly poisoning their children with the same deadly remedy, believing they're being good parents. This isn't a story about evil mothers or deliberate harm. This is the tragic tale of how an entire society created a system so broken that loving parents became accidental killers, and how the very medicine meant to soothe became the silent destroyer of a generation. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how Victorian England's most respected pharmaceutical companies built empires on infant addiction, why doctors prescribed poison as medicine, and how working mothers became trapped in a cycle of dependency that claimed thousands of innocent lives. But first, let me show you exactly how this nightmare began. The year is 1805, and Friedrich Serturner, a young German pharmacist, has just isolated something extraordinary from opium poppies. He calls it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. What Serturner doesn't anticipate is that his discovery will soon flood the medicine cabinets of Victorian Britain, transforming from a medical breakthrough into a domestic catastrophe. But morphine doesn't arrive in Britain as morphine. It arrives disguised as something far more innocent, something that sounds perfectly safe for the smallest members of society. The pharmaceutical companies of Victorian England are about to commit one of history's most devastating acts of mass deception, and they're going to do it with smiling advertisements and motherly endorsements. Meet Mrs. Winslow, or rather, the fictional character created to sell what would become Britain's most popular infant remedy. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup promises desperate mothers everything they dream of: quiet nights, peaceful babies, and relief from the endless crying that accompanies teething, colic, and childhood illness. The advertisements show a kindly grandmother figure, radiating maternal wisdom and trustworthiness. What those advertisements don't mention is that each bottle contains enough morphine to create physical dependence in a newborn within days. The formula is devastating in its effectiveness: morphine sulfate, alcohol, and just enough sugar to mask the bitter taste. 1 spoonful silences a crying infant for hours. 2 spoons can silence them forever. Sarah Whitmore, our Manchester mother, first discovers Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup through her neighbour, Elizabeth Hartwell. Elizabeth swears by the remedy, claiming it saved her sanity during her youngest son's difficult teething period. What Elizabeth doesn't mention is that little Thomas now screams inconsolably whenever the medicine wears off, requiring increasingly frequent doses to maintain his quiet demeanour. The tragedy unfolding in working-class neighbourhoods across Britain isn't happening in isolation. Victorian society has created the perfect conditions for this disaster through a combination of industrial demands, medical ignorance, and social pressures that make these deadly remedies seem like miraculous solutions. Consider the life of a typical working mother in the 1860s Birmingham. Mary Thompson rises before dawn to prepare breakfast for her husband and 3 surviving children. Her husband departs for the metalworks at 5 in the morning and won't return until after dark. Mary then walks 2 miles to the textile factory where she operates dangerous machinery for 12 hours straight, her youngest child strapped to her back because no childcare exists for working mothers. When Mary returns home exhausted, she faces cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and caring for children who are often sick from the polluted air and contaminated water that characterizes industrial cities. If her baby cries through the night, Mary cannot rest, which means she cannot perform her factory duties the next day, which means her family cannot afford rent or food. Into this impossible situation steps the pharmaceutical industry with what appears to be a perfect solution. For just a few pence, a mother can purchase peace, quiet, and the ability to function in an unforgiving economic system. The tragedy is that these mothers are making rational decisions based on deliberately misleading information. The marketing of infant opiates in Victorian Britain represents one of history's most sophisticated campaigns of medical misinformation. Companies like the Anglo-American Drug Company don't simply advertise their products. They create entire mythologies around them. Mrs. Winslow becomes a trusted family friend through carefully crafted testimonials and endorsements. One advertisement from 1867 reads, "Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup has been used by millions of mothers for their children while teething with perfect success. It soothes the child, softens the gums, allays all pain, relieves wind, regulates the bowels, and is the best known remedy for diarrhea arising from teething or other causes." The advertisement continues with testimonials from grateful mothers across America and Britain, describing miraculous recoveries and peaceful nights. What readers don't see are the testimonials that never get published, the letters from mothers like Margaret Davies of Cardiff, whose 6-month-old daughter died after 3 weeks of regular syrup use, or James Peterson of Edinburgh, whose twin boys both succumbed to respiratory failure after being given double doses during a particularly difficult night. The success of these marketing campaigns relies heavily on the medical establishment's endorsement of opiate remedies for children. Victorian doctors, working with limited understanding of addiction and pharmacology, genuinely believe they are prescribing safe and effective treatments. Dr. William Richardson, a prominent London physician, writes in his 1863 medical journal that morphine-based preparations represent a godsend for the overworked mother and the suffering child. This medical endorsement gives mothers like Sarah Whitmore complete confidence in their choice to use these remedies. When the family doctor recommends Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for her teething baby, Sarah has no reason to question the prescription. The combination of medical authority and desperate need creates an irresistible appeal for these deadly products. But the true scope of this tragedy becomes clear when we examine the daily routines that develop around these medicines. What begins as occasional use for specific ailments quickly evolves into regular dosing schedules that would horrify modern parents. Take the case of Emma Blackwood, a seamstress in Liverpool whose husband died in a factory accident, leaving her to raise 4 children alone while working piece-rate sewing from their single room. Emma discovers that a small dose of Godfrey's cordial, another popular morphine preparation, allows her to work through the night while her children sleep soundly. What starts as emergency childcare becomes nightly routine. Emma begins giving her children the cordial every evening at 7 o'clock, not because they are sick or teething, but because it enables her to work the extra hours necessary for survival. Within weeks, her children begin showing signs of physical dependence. They become irritable and restless as the evening dose approaches, and impossible to manage without their medicine. The pharmaceutical companies marketing these products understand exactly what is happening. Internal documents from the Anglo-American Drug Company, discovered years later, reveal that executives refer to their infant customers as repeat business and celebrate the loyalty that their products inspire. They know that babies given regular doses of morphine will require those doses indefinitely, creating guaranteed sales for years. This deliberate cultivation of infant addiction represents one of the most callous business practices in industrial history. Companies design their products to create dependency while marketing them as one-time solutions to temporary problems. The disconnect between marketing promises and actual effects creates a cycle of escalating use that traps families in patterns of unknowing abuse. The social pressures surrounding Victorian motherhood make these products even more appealing to desperate women. Society expects mothers to maintain perfectly behaved children while contributing to household income and managing domestic duties without any support systems. The promise of chemical assistance becomes irresistible when the alternative is social judgment and economic catastrophe. Consider how Mary Thompson's neighbours evaluate her mothering skills. If her baby cries during church services, Mary faces whispered criticism about her inability to control her child. If her children appear restless or difficult during social gatherings, other mothers assume Mary lacks proper maternal instincts. The pressure to present calm, well-behaved children creates enormous incentive to use any available remedy. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup and similar products offer Mary the appearance of successful motherhood while concealing the chemical manipulation required to achieve that appearance. Her neighbours admire her peaceful babies and seek her advice about managing their own difficult children, never suspecting that Mary's success comes from a bottle rather than superior parenting skills. This social dynamic accelerates the spread of infant opiate use throughout British communities. Successful mothers become inadvertent drug dealers, sharing their secrets with struggling friends and relatives. The products spread through networks of female friendship and mutual support, with each recommendation carrying the weight of personal testimony and social proof. The medical establishment's ignorance about addiction compounds this tragedy by providing scientific legitimacy for increasingly dangerous practices. Victorian doctors understand very little about how morphine affects developing brains and bodies, and they consistently underestimate both the potency of commercial preparations and the speed with which infants develop tolerance and dependence. Dr. Thomas Morrison of the Royal College of Physicians publishes a widely read guide in 1869 that recommends morphine-based remedies for dozens of childhood ailments, from simple restlessness to serious respiratory infections. His dosage recommendations, based on adult tolerance levels rather than infant physiology, routinely call for amounts that would render modern pediatricians speechless with horror. This brings us to the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire story, the mothers themselves. These women are not villains in this story. They are victims of a system designed to exploit their love for their children. Sarah Whitmore doesn't wake up each morning planning to harm her baby. She wakes up planning to survive another day in a world that offers working mothers impossible choices and then judges them for the decisions they make. The daily reality for mothers like Sarah involves calculations that no parent should ever have to make. When her baby screams for hours with teething pain, Sarah must choose between losing sleep she desperately needs for factory work the next day or giving medicine that brings instant relief. When her employer threatens termination for bringing a crying child to work, Sarah must choose between her job and her maternal instincts. The pharmaceutical companies understand these impossible choices and craft their marketing to exploit them. They don't sell medicine, they sell solutions to the fundamental contradictions of Victorian working motherhood. Their advertisements promise that good mothers use their products, while bad mothers allow their children to suffer needlessly. Elizabeth Hartwell, Sarah's neighbour, who first recommended Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, genuinely believes she discovered a miracle cure. When little Thomas finally sleeps through the night after weeks of teething misery, Elizabeth feels like she's conquered motherhood itself. She doesn't recognize that Thomas's peaceful demeanor during the day stems from morphine sedation rather than natural contentment. Elizabeth begins recommending the syrup to every mother she encounters, sharing detailed instructions about dosages and timing with the enthusiasm of someone who has found the secret to successful parenting. Her recommendations carry tremendous weight because other mothers can see the results with their own eyes. Thomas appears calm, content, and remarkably well-behaved compared to other children his age. What Elizabeth doesn't notice is that Thomas requires increasingly frequent doses to maintain his docile state. What began as nighttime medicine for teething pain becomes morning medicine for general fussiness, afternoon medicine for mealtime resistance, and evening medicine for bedtime cooperation. Within months, Thomas receives morphine 4 times daily, not because he experiences pain, but because he cannot function normally without chemical assistance. The escalation of infant opiate use follows predictable patterns that repeat in households across Britain. Mothers begin with conservative dosing for specific ailments, then gradually increase frequency and quantity as their children develop tolerance. The pharmaceutical companies facilitate this progression by offering products in multiple strengths and formulations, allowing parents to customize their poisoning protocols. Godfrey's cordial markets itself as a milder alternative to Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, containing supposedly gentle ingredients suitable for the most delicate constitutions. What parents don't realize is that Godfrey's cordial contains the same morphine base as stronger preparations, simply diluted with additional alcohol and sugar to mask its potency. Mothers who switch to Godfrey's cordial, believing they are reducing their children's drug exposure, actually maintain the same level of morphine while adding alcohol dependency to the equation. The tragic irony is that many mothers recognize something is wrong with their children's behavior, but interpret the symptoms as evidence that more medicine is needed rather than less. When babies become irritable and restless as their doses wear off, mothers assume their children are experiencing renewed illness rather than withdrawal symptoms. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating as each dose temporarily relieves the suffering caused by the previous dose. Emma Blackwood, the Liverpool seamstress whose husband died in the factory accident, develops an elaborate dosing schedule for her 4 children that would impress modern addiction specialists with its precision and complexity. Her oldest daughter receives Godfrey's cordial at breakfast to ensure classroom compliance. Her twin sons get Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup before afternoon naps to allow Emma uninterrupted work time, and her baby receives both preparations at bedtime to guarantee night-long sleep. Emma tracks her children's medicine consumption in a notebook with the same attention she devotes to household expenses, recording doses, timing, and behavioral responses with meticulous detail. She notices that her children require larger amounts over time to achieve the same calming effects, but interprets this as evidence of growing bodies needing proportionally increased medication rather than developing tolerance to addictive substances. The pharmaceutical industry encourages this medicalization of childhood behavior through increasingly sophisticated marketing campaigns that pathologize normal developmental stages. Teething becomes a medical emergency requiring immediate chemical intervention. Childhood restlessness transforms into a behavioral disorder demanding pharmaceutical management. Natural sleep patterns are redefined as problematic conditions that only their products can correct. Dr. James Mitchell, a prominent pediatric specialist in Manchester, publishes influential articles throughout the 1860s describing childhood as a series of medical challenges requiring constant pharmaceutical vigilance. His widely circulated pamphlet, The Modern Mother's Medicine Cabinet, recommends maintaining supplies of at least 6 different morphine-based preparations to address various childhood ailments and behavioral issues. Mitchell's medical authority gives mothers permission to medicate their children for increasingly minor concerns. A fussy appetite becomes grounds for Godfrey's cordial before meals. Difficulty settling for naps justifies Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup administration. Resistance to bedtime routines requires double doses of both preparations to ensure household harmony. The normalization of infant opiate use reaches extraordinary levels in some British communities where virtually every family maintains multiple bottles of morphine-based remedies and considers their regular use a sign of responsible parenting. Mothers who attempt to raise children without pharmaceutical assistance face social pressure and practical difficulties that make their choice nearly impossible to maintain. Margaret Collins, a baker's wife in York, initially resists using commercial remedies with her first child, believing that natural methods should suffice for normal childhood challenges. Margaret's resolve crumbles when her drug-free infant's normal crying and fussiness make her the target of constant criticism from neighbours, relatives, and even strangers who encounter her family in public settings. The social stigma of having difficult children becomes unbearable when Margaret realises that every other mother in her community successfully maintains peaceful, compliant offspring through chemical means. Her natural parenting methods make her appear negligent and incompetent compared to mothers who have embraced pharmaceutical solutions to behavioural management. Margaret's conversion to infant opiate use illustrates how social pressure reinforces the pharmaceutical industry's marketing messages. When she finally purchases her first bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Margaret feels like she's joining a community of successful mothers rather than beginning a pattern of child abuse. The immediate transformation in her baby's behaviour confirms that she made the right decision to abandon her previous resistance to chemical intervention. The success of these products creates powerful testimonial networks that spread through every level of Victorian society. Upper-class mothers recommend the same morphine-based remedies used by working-class families, though they often purchase more expensive formulations with elaborate packaging and prestigious brand names. The universality of infant opiate use across social boundaries gives the practice an appearance of medical legitimacy and social acceptability that makes questioning it seem ignorant or radical. Lady Catherine Pemberton, wife of a prominent London banker, maintains an extensive medicine cabinet stocked with premium versions of the same morphine preparations used by factory workers' families. Lady Pemberton's nursery governess administers carefully measured doses according to schedules designed to maintain perfect behavioural compliance during social events, family gatherings, and educational activities. The upper classes develop particularly sophisticated approaches to infant medication that involve multiple preparations for different occasions and behavioural requirements. Morning tonics containing light morphine doses ensure docile behaviour during lessons and social interactions. Afternoon cordials provide energy management for structured activities and supervised play. Evening syrups guarantee uninterrupted sleep that allows parents to maintain active social calendars without childcare concerns. This systematic approach to childhood chemical management represents the complete medicalization of normal developmental processes. Every aspect of infant and child behavior becomes subject to pharmaceutical intervention, from appetite and sleep patterns to mood regulation and social compliance. The idea that children might naturally experience discomfort, restlessness, or emotional expression without requiring immediate chemical correction disappears from Victorian parenting culture. The tragedy deepens when we examine how these practices affect the children themselves as they grow beyond infancy while maintaining their chemical dependencies. 8-year-old Thomas Hartwell has never experienced a day without morphine in his bloodstream. What began as teething medicine in infancy has evolved into a complex daily regimen that governs every aspect of his existence. Thomas cannot eat breakfast without his morning cordial, cannot attend school without his midday tonic, and cannot sleep without his evening syrup. His mother Elizabeth believes she's maintaining his health through careful pharmaceutical management, never recognizing that Thomas has become completely dependent on chemical assistance for basic human functions. Thomas's case illustrates the devastating long-term consequences of infant opiate exposure that Victorian families are only beginning to understand. Children who receive regular morphine doses from birth develop not only physical dependence, but profound alterations in their emotional and cognitive development. These children never learn natural coping mechanisms for discomfort, frustration, or normal childhood stress, because chemical intervention has always provided instant relief from any unpleasant sensation. The behavioural patterns that emerge in these morphine-dependent children create new categories of childhood pathology that Victorian doctors struggle to understand. Children like Thomas display what physicians describe as nervous conditions, characterized by extreme agitation when medications are delayed, inability to self-soothe during minor upsets, and complete reliance on chemical intervention for emotional regulation. Dr. Henry Ashworth of the Birmingham Children's Hospital begins noticing alarming trends in the children brought to his clinic during the late 1860s. Increasing numbers of young patients exhibit symptoms that puzzle medical understanding. Children who scream inconsolably without apparent cause, who cannot sleep without medication, who display violent tantrums over minor disappointments, and who seem incapable of normal childhood resilience. Ashworth's initial assumption is that these children suffer from inherited nervous disorders or environmental toxins affecting urban populations. The possibility that popular infant medicines might cause these symptoms doesn't occur to him because the medical establishment has endorsed these remedies for decades. The connection between daily morphine administration and abnormal childhood behavior remains invisible to practitioners who view pharmaceutical intervention as therapeutic rather than harmful. Meanwhile, the children themselves develop increasingly sophisticated relationships with their chemical dependencies. 10-year-old Emma Blackwood, daughter of the Liverpool seamstress, has learned to recognize the subtle sensations that indicate her morning dose is wearing off. She experiences anxiety, restlessness, and difficulty concentrating that she doesn't understand but knows will disappear when her mother provides the familiar sweet liquid from the brown bottle. Emma has developed elaborate rituals around her medication schedule that reveal the psychological dependence accompanying her physical addiction. She counts the hours until her next dose, hoards small amounts of medicine in secret hiding places, and experiences panic attacks when family routines threaten to delay her regular administration times. Emma's behavior demonstrates how childhood morphine exposure creates not just chemical dependence, but complex psychological relationships with pharmaceutical substances. The tragedy extends beyond individual families, as entire communities of children grow up sharing similar dependencies and behavioral patterns. Schools in industrial cities report increasing difficulties managing students who display aggressive outbursts, cannot concentrate without medication, and require pharmaceutical intervention to participate in normal classroom activities. Miss Adelaide Thompson, headmistress of the Whitmore Street Elementary School in Manchester, maintains detailed records of student behaviour that reveal disturbing trends throughout the 1870s. Her logs document increasing numbers of children who arrive late because their morning medicine schedules conflict with school timing, who cannot complete lessons without midday pharmaceutical breaks, and who display violent behaviour when their medication routines are disrupted. Thompson initially attributes these problems to the moral degradation she believes accompanies urban poverty and industrial employment. The possibility that widespread infant medication practices might be creating a generation of drug-dependent children doesn't enter her educational philosophy. She responds to behavioural challenges by recommending that parents increase their children's pharmaceutical management, rather than questioning whether chemical intervention might be causing the problems she observes. The pharmaceutical companies recognise the emerging market of older children who require continued medication to function normally. They develop new product lines specifically targeting school-aged children with formulations designed to provide discrete dosing during educational hours and social activities. These products represent the natural evolution of infant opiate marketing into comprehensive childhood chemical management systems. Dalby's Carminative emerges as the leading pharmaceutical solution for school-age behavioural management, marketed specifically to mothers whose children have outgrown traditional infant remedies but still require chemical assistance for daily functioning. The advertisements emphasise the product's suitability for classroom use, promising that properly medicated children will display model behaviour that reflects positively on their family's social standing. The marketing campaign for Dalby's Carminative reveals how completely Victorian society has accepted the medicalisation of childhood behaviour. Advertisements feature testimonials from teachers praising students whose pharmaceutical management enables superior academic performance and social compliance. Parents are encouraged to view continued medication as investment in their children's educational and social success, rather than perpetuation of harmful dependencies. Sarah Whitmore's youngest son, now 5 years old, exemplifies the tragic progression from infant medication to childhood addiction. Little William requires increasingly complex pharmaceutical management as his body develops tolerance to standard preparations. Sarah maintains a detailed schedule that involves 3 different morphine-based products administered at precise intervals throughout the day to maintain William's behavioral stability. William's daily routine revolves entirely around his medication schedule in ways that would be immediately recognizable to modern addiction specialists as classic dependency behavior. He becomes anxious and agitated as dose times approach, cannot participate in normal childhood activities without chemical assistance, and displays withdrawal symptoms that Sarah interprets as evidence that he needs stronger or more frequent medication. The cycle of escalating use that began with infant teething medicine has evolved into comprehensive chemical dependency that affects every aspect of William's development. He has never experienced natural emotional regulation, normal sleep patterns, or authentic responses to environmental stimuli because morphine has mediated every sensation and experience since birth. Sarah genuinely believes she is providing excellent maternal care through careful pharmaceutical management of William's needs. She views mothers who allow their children to experience discomfort or behavioral challenges without immediate chemical intervention as negligent or ignorant. The possibility that her devoted medication practices might be harming William rather than helping him contradicts everything she has learned about responsible motherhood. The medical establishment continues endorsing and expanding childhood pharmaceutical practices despite mounting evidence of their harmful effects. Dr. Richardson's latest publication recommends morphine-based preparations for dozens of childhood conditions that previous generations managed through natural means. His influence extends these dangerous practices into middle-class families who previously relied on non-pharmaceutical approaches to childhood challenges. Richardson's medical authority legitimizes the transformation of normal childhood experiences into pathological conditions requiring immediate chemical intervention. Childhood curiosity becomes hyperactivity demanding pharmaceutical control. Natural emotional expression transforms into behavioral disorders requiring medication management. Normal developmental challenges are redefined as medical emergencies that only morphine-based preparations can address adequately. The expansion of childhood medication practices creates new categories of family dysfunction as parents become increasingly dependent on pharmaceutical solutions for basic child-rearing challenges. Families lose confidence in natural parenting instincts and traditional child management techniques, believing that modern scientific medicine has replaced obsolete methods with superior chemical interventions. Mary Thompson's household exemplifies this complete pharmaceutical dependence in family functioning. Mary maintains elaborate medication schedules for all 3 of her surviving children, each requiring different preparations at different times for different behavioral objectives. Her daily routine revolves around administering, monitoring, and adjusting chemical interventions that have replaced traditional parenting methods entirely. Mary's medicine cabinet contains more pharmaceutical products than food supplies, reflecting the prioritization of chemical management over basic nutritional needs in her household budgeting. She spends more on morphine-based remedies than on rent or clothing, viewing pharmaceutical expenses as essential investments in family stability rather than discretionary purchases that might be reduced during financial difficulties. The economic burden of maintaining multiple childhood pharmaceutical dependencies creates additional stress for working-class families already struggling with industrial wages and urban living costs. Mothers like Mary face impossible choices between purchasing necessary medications for their chemically dependent children and providing adequate food or shelter for their families. The pharmaceutical companies exploit this economic vulnerability by offering payment plans and bulk purchasing options that enable families to maintain their children's drug dependencies even during financial crises. These business practices reveal the industry's understanding that childhood addiction creates guaranteed long-term revenue streams that justify aggressive marketing investments and flexible pricing strategies. Elizabeth Hartwell's family budget illustrates the financial impact of childhood pharmaceutical dependency on typical working-class households. Elizabeth spends nearly 30% of her husband's factory wages on morphine-based preparations for Thomas and their newer baby, whose medication requirements have expanded beyond simple teething remedies into comprehensive behavioral management systems. The proportion of family income devoted to childhood medications continues increasing as children develop tolerance and require stronger or more frequent dosing to maintain behavioral stability. Elizabeth finds herself reducing spending on food, clothing, and heating fuel to ensure adequate supplies of the pharmaceutical products her children need for basic functioning. This economic pressure creates additional incentives for mothers to maintain their children's chemical dependencies rather than attempting withdrawal or reduction strategies that might temporarily increase behavioral challenges. The immediate costs of managing unmedicated children, lost wages from workplace disruptions, social embarrassment from public behavioral problems, household chaos from normal childhood activities, seem more threatening than the long-term financial burden of perpetual pharmaceutical dependence. The social infrastructure supporting childhood medication practices becomes increasingly elaborate as communities develop shared expectations around pharmaceutical child management. Neighbors exchange information about dosing strategies, teachers coordinate classroom activities around student medication schedules, and extended families plan gatherings that accommodate multiple children's chemical dependency requirements. This community-wide normalization of childhood drug dependence creates powerful social pressure against parents who might question the wisdom of continued pharmaceutical intervention. Mothers who attempt to reduce their children's medication face criticism from neighbors who view natural parenting methods as harmful neglect of modern medical advances. Margaret Collins's experience attempting to withdraw her older child from morphine-based remedies illustrates the social obstacles facing parents who recognize the harmful effects of childhood pharmaceutical dependence. Margaret's decision to gradually reduce her son's medication triggers concerned interventions from relatives, neighbors, and even strangers who observed the temporary behavioral challenges that accompany withdrawal processes. The community response to Margaret's natural parenting experiment demonstrates how completely Victorian society has accepted chemical intervention as normal and necessary for proper child management. Her son's natural childhood behavior, curiosity, energy, emotional expression, resistance to arbitrary authority, is interpreted by observers as evidence of maternal neglect and medical emergency, requiring immediate pharmaceutical correction. Margaret's isolation during her son's withdrawal process reveals the absence of social support systems for parents attempting to break childhood pharmaceutical dependencies. No medical professionals offer guidance for managing withdrawal symptoms. No community resources exist for families transitioning away from chemical child management, and no social networks provide encouragement for parents questioning mainstream pharmaceutical practices. The lack of institutional support for alternative approaches to childhood management reflects the complete integration of morphine-based remedies into Victorian social structures. Schools expect chemically managed students. Employers assume working mothers will use pharmaceutical solutions for childcare challenges. And medical professionals view childhood medication as scientific progress, rather than dangerous experimentation on developing human beings. This systematic normalization of childhood drug dependence represents one of history's most successful campaigns of social engineering through pharmaceutical marketing. The industry has transformed natural childhood development into pathological conditions requiring chemical intervention while convincing entire communities that loving parents embrace rather than resist these dangerous practices. The children caught in this system face developmental challenges that extend far beyond simple chemical dependence. They are growing up without experiencing authentic emotions, natural sleep patterns, genuine social interactions, or normal responses to environmental stimuli. Their entire understanding of human experience is mediated through pharmaceutical intervention in ways that will affect their adult relationships, parenting practices, and social functioning for decades to come. As these chemically dependent children approach adolescence, new challenges emerge that Victorian society is completely unprepared to address. 15-year-old Thomas Hartwell stands before his mother's medicine cabinet, his hands trembling with an urgency that Elizabeth mistakes for excitement about his upcoming apprenticeship at the local ironworks. Thomas has been awake since 3 a.m, his body screaming for the relief that only comes from the familiar brown bottles lined up like loyal soldiers on the kitchen shelf. He has not told his mother that he now requires twice the evening dose to fall asleep, or that he steals sips from her daytime supply when the craving becomes unbearable. Thomas represents the first generation of Victorian children to reach adolescence with lifelong morphine dependencies, and neither he nor his family understands the catastrophic challenges ahead. His body, now larger and more resistant to the drug's effects, demands quantities that would have killed him as an infant. His mind, never having developed natural coping mechanisms, faces the emotional turbulence of adolescence without any psychological tools beyond chemical suppression. Elizabeth watches her son's restless pacing and attributes it to nervous excitement about entering the adult workforce. She increases his morning dose of Godfrey's cordial, believing that additional pharmaceutical support will help Thomas manage the stress of new responsibilities. What Elizabeth doesn't recognize is that Thomas's agitation stems from withdrawal symptoms that begin within hours of his last dose, creating a cycle of suffering that only temporary chemical relief can break. The ironworks foreman, Mr. James Crowley, has developed unofficial policies for managing the increasing numbers of young apprentices who arrive at his factory, displaying what he calls nervous conditions. Crowley maintains a supply of patent medicines in his office, dispensing them to workers whose productivity suffers from what he assumes are inherited weaknesses rather than withdrawal symptoms from childhood pharmaceutical dependencies. Crowley's accommodation of worker medication needs reflects the broader industrial adaptation to a chemically dependent workforce emerging from Victorian childhood pharmaceutical practices. Factory supervisors learn to recognize the signs of workers requiring pharmaceutical intervention and develop scheduling accommodations that allow for medication breaks without acknowledging the underlying addiction issues driving these requirements. Thomas's first weeks at the ironworks reveal the devastating impact of childhood morphine exposure on adolescent development. He cannot concentrate on detailed tasks without chemical assistance, becomes violently agitated when his medication schedule conflicts with work demands, and displays emotional outbursts that terrify his fellow apprentices. The survival skills that should have developed naturally during childhood remain completely absent, replaced by pharmaceutical dependence that now threatens his ability to function in adult society. The medical establishment begins encountering new categories of patients as morphine-dependent children reach adolescence with unprecedented psychological and physical challenges. Dr. Ashworth's clinic in Birmingham sees increasing numbers of teenagers displaying symptoms that defy traditional diagnostic categories. Young people who cannot sleep without sedation, who become violent during medication delays, and who seem incapable of normal emotional regulation. Ashworth's colleague, Dr. Margaret Foster, becomes one of the first medical professionals to suspect a connection between popular infant remedies and the behavioral problems she observes in adolescent patients. Her careful questioning reveals that virtually every troubled teenager in her practice has a history of regular morphine-based medication dating back to infancy. But her attempts to discuss these observations with senior physicians meet resistance from colleagues who refuse to consider that endorsed medical practices might be causing harm. Foster's pioneering recognition of childhood pharmaceutical damage represents a dangerous challenge to the economic interests of companies that have built empires on infant addiction. Her research threatens to expose the devastating long-term consequences of practices that generate enormous profits for manufacturers, distributors, and retailers throughout the British pharmaceutical supply chain. The industry response to emerging criticism involves sophisticated campaigns designed to discredit medical professionals who question childhood pharmaceutical practices. Company-sponsored research publications emphasize the safety and necessity of morphine-based remedies while attacking critics as irresponsible radicals who would deny children access to modern medical advances. Dr. Richardson publishes a scathing response to Foster's preliminary findings, arguing that childhood behavioral problems stem from moral degeneracy and inadequate pharmaceutical management rather than excessive medication use. His article, funded by pharmaceutical industry grants, receives wide distribution through medical journals and popular publications, effectively silencing Foster's research by portraying her as a dangerous extremist whose theories threaten child welfare. Meanwhile, the human cost of this controversy plays out in families across Britain as parents struggle with adolescent children whose pharmaceutical dependencies have evolved into unmanageable addictions. Sarah Whitmore faces increasingly desperate situations as William's medication requirements exceed her ability to afford adequate supplies while maintaining household expenses. William, now 12 years old, requires pharmaceutical intervention every few hours to maintain basic functionality. His tolerance to standard preparations has grown so extreme that Sarah must purchase the strongest available formulations and supplement them with alcohol-based tonics to achieve temporary behavioral stability. The cost of maintaining William's chemical needs consumes nearly half of the family's income, forcing impossible choices between medication and necessities like food and fuel. Sarah's dilemma illustrates the trap facing thousands of Victorian families whose children have aged beyond the cute infant stage that made their pharmaceutical dependence seem manageable. Adolescent addiction lacks the social sympathy extended to medicated babies, creating shame and isolation for families dealing with drug-dependent teenagers, whose behavior has become increasingly erratic and dangerous. The social infrastructure that supported childhood medication practices begins breaking down when faced with adolescent pharmaceutical dependencies that cannot be disguised or managed through simple parenting strategies. Schools refuse to accommodate teenagers whose medication needs disrupt classroom activities. Employers reject apprentices whose drug requirements interfere with work schedules, and communities withdraw support from families whose adolescent children display violent or unpredictable behavior. Emma Blackwood's eldest daughter, now 14, exemplifies the social isolation facing drug-dependent adolescents in Victorian Britain. Mary Blackwood cannot attend school regularly because her withdrawal symptoms create classroom disruptions that teachers refuse to tolerate. She cannot maintain employment because her medication schedule conflicts with work requirements. She cannot participate in normal social activities because her chemical needs make spontaneous interactions impossible. Mary's isolation deepens as her pharmaceutical requirements become increasingly expensive and difficult to obtain through legal channels. The patent medicines that sustained her childhood dependence prove inadequate for her adolescent tolerance levels, forcing Emma to seek stronger preparations through informal networks of desperate parents, sharing information about underground pharmaceutical sources. The emergence of illegal drug markets to serve adolescent pharmaceutical dependencies represents the predictable evolution of childhood medication practices into criminal enterprises. Entrepreneurial individuals recognize the profit potential in supplying morphine preparations to families whose children have outgrown legal remedies, creating shadow economies that operate outside medical supervision or safety regulations. Thomas Hartwell's introduction to illegal pharmaceutical sources occurs through his workplace connections at the ironworks, where older workers maintain relationships with suppliers who provide morphine preparations too strong for legal sale. Thomas begins purchasing his own medication supplies, hiding his transactions from Elizabeth while spending his entire apprentice wages on increasingly powerful drug preparations. The transition from family-managed medication to independent drug purchasing represents a crucial turning point in the lives of morphine-dependent adolescents. Parents lose control over their children's pharmaceutical consumption, just as those children develop adult-level tolerance, requiring dangerous quantities of increasingly pure morphine preparations. Elizabeth's discovery of Thomas's independent drug purchasing triggers a family crisis that illuminates the complete breakdown of childhood pharmaceutical management systems when faced with adolescent addiction realities. She realizes that her loving attempts to medicate Thomas's childhood challenges have created a monster she cannot control or cure through maternal intervention. Elizabeth's desperate attempts to regain control over Thomas's drug use involve strategies that would be immediately familiar to modern families dealing with teenage addiction: hiding money, monitoring his whereabouts, searching his belongings for hidden drug supplies, and pleading with him to return to the manageable medication schedules of his childhood. Thomas's response to his mother's intervention efforts demonstrates how completely his personality has been shaped by pharmaceutical dependence. He becomes manipulative, dishonest, and occasionally violent in pursuit of the chemical relief that has defined his existence since infancy. The loving child Elizabeth remembered disappears entirely when his drug supplies are threatened, replaced by someone she no longer recognizes as her son. The psychological impact on parents who recognize their role in creating their children's addictions represents one of the most devastating consequences of Victorian pharmaceutical marketing campaigns. Mothers like Elizabeth must confront the reality that their loving efforts to provide the best possible care have instead created suffering that may be irreversible. The medical establishment's response to growing evidence of pharmaceutical harm involves increasingly desperate attempts to maintain credibility while protecting industry relationships that provide lucrative consulting fees and research funding. Physicians develop elaborate theoretical frameworks that attribute adolescent behavioral problems to inherited moral defects rather than acknowledging the iatrogenic nature of childhood medication practices. Dr. Richardson's latest publication introduces the concept of constitutional weakness to explain why some children develop problematic relationships with beneficial medical treatments. His theory suggests that pharmaceutical difficulties reflect pre-existing character flaws rather than predictable consequences of regular morphine administration, effectively blaming victims while absolving the medical profession of responsibility for harmful prescribing practices. The constitutional weakness theory gains rapid acceptance among physicians who need scientific justification for continuing profitable childhood medication practices, despite mounting evidence of their harmful effects. Medical conferences throughout Britain feature presentations describing inherited tendencies toward pharmaceutical abuse, while carefully avoiding discussion of dosage relationships or withdrawal phenomena that might implicate standard prescribing practices. This medical gaslighting campaign creates additional suffering for families dealing with adolescent pharmaceutical dependencies by convinced that their children parents' problems reflect moral failings rather than predictable physiological responses to chronic drug exposure. Mothers blame themselves for producing defective children, while fathers assume their offspring inherited weakness that no amount of discipline can correct. William Whitmore's behavior deteriorates rapidly as his pharmaceutical needs exceed his family's ability to provide adequate supplies through legal channels. His withdrawal episodes become longer and more violent, requiring Sarah to seek increasingly dangerous drug sources to maintain household stability. William's transformation from a manageable medicated child into an unpredictable adolescent addict forces Sarah to choose between her son's immediate chemical needs and her family's long-term safety. The impossible choices facing mothers of drug-dependent adolescents reflect the complete absence of social support systems for families dealing with pharmaceutical addiction problems. No medical treatments exist for childhood morphine dependence. No institutions provide care for addicted adolescents, and no legal frameworks address the unique challenges of iatrogenic addiction created through medical recommendation. Sarah's isolation deepens as neighbors withdraw support from a family whose adolescent son displays increasingly erratic and frightening behavior. The community sympathy that surrounded infant medication practices disappears when faced with teenage pharmaceutical dependence that threatens neighborhood stability and safety. The social abandonment of families dealing with adolescent drug addiction creates desperate situations that drive parents to extreme measures. Emma Blackwood begins diluting her daughter's morphine preparations with dangerous substances in attempts to extend inadequate supplies, creating additional health risks while failing to address underlying addiction issues. Emma's improvised pharmaceutical management represents the breakdown of any pretense of medical supervision over childhood drug dependencies that have evolved beyond parental control. Desperate mothers become amateur chemists, mixing potentially lethal combinations of substances in futile attempts to satisfy their children's chemical needs without adequate financial resources or medical guidance. The tragic irony is that many of these mothers possess detailed knowledge about morphine preparations and pharmaceutical management techniques that would impress modern addiction specialists. Years of carefully monitoring their children's medication responses have created expertise that remains completely unsupported by professional medical resources when families need help managing addiction crises. Mary Blackwood's overdose represents age 15, the inevitable culmination of childhood pharmaceutical practices that were never designed to address long-term dependency issues. Emma's desperate attempt to provide adequate sedation during a particularly severe withdrawal episode results in respiratory depression that kills her daughter within hours of administration. Mary's death illuminates the complete failure of Victorian society to recognize or address the deadly consequences of childhood pharmaceutical marketing campaigns. Her overdose is recorded as accidental poisoning rather than predictable outcome of lifetime morphine dependence, allowing the medical establishment to avoid confronting the systemic nature of pharmaceutical harm affecting thousands of British children. The official response to increasing numbers of adolescent pharmaceutical deaths involves bureaucratic strategies designed to obscure rather than address underlying causation. Coroner reports emphasize accidental nature of overdoses, while avoiding discussion of childhood medication histories that might implicate standard medical practices in creating fatal dependencies. Emma Blackwood's grief transforms into rage as she recognizes the role of pharmaceutical marketing in her daughter's death. Her attempts to seek justice through legal channels meet resistance from authorities who refuse to acknowledge connections between popular remedies and adult infantescent addiction fatalities. Emma's legal challenges threaten the entire structure of childhood pharmaceutical commerce by demanding accountability for marketing practices that create dependencies leading to death. Her case represents the first serious attempt to hold manufacturers responsible for the long-term consequences of infant medication campaigns that generate enormous profits while creating lifelong suffering. The pharmaceutical industry's response to Emma's lawsuit involves legal strategies designed to establish precedents protecting manufacturers from liability for properly marketed medical products. Company attorneys argue that morphine-based remedies represent legitimate medical treatments whose misuse reflects consumer error rather than product defects or misleading marketing. The legal battle over pharmaceutical liability reveals the sophisticated infrastructure protecting childhood medication practices from accountability. Industry lawyers, medical expert witnesses, and regulatory officials coordinate responses that prioritize commercial interests over child welfare, while maintaining appearances of scientific objectivity and medical ethics. Thomas Hartwell's arrest for theft represents another common trajectory for morphine-dependent adolescents whose chemical needs exceed their legal means of acquisition. His desperate attempts to steal money for drug purchases result in criminal charges that further complicate his family's ability to address his underlying addiction issues. The criminal justice system's response to pharmaceutical addiction involves punitive approaches that ignore the medical origins of adolescent drug dependence. Thomas faces imprisonment for behavior that stems directly from childhood medication practices endorsed by medical authorities and actively promoted through commercial marketing campaigns. Elizabeth's attempts to explain Thomas's medical history to court officials meet skepticism from judges who cannot comprehend how legitimate infant remedies might create criminal behavior in adolescence. The legal system lacks conceptual frameworks for understanding iatrogenic addiction, treating pharmaceutical dependence as moral failure rather than medical consequence. The criminalization of adolescent pharmaceutical addiction represents the final abandonment of children whose dependencies were created through socially sanctioned medical practices. Society's response shifts from sympathetic support for medicated infants to punitive rejection of addicted teenagers, effectively discarding individuals whose problems stem from collective failure to recognize pharmaceutical harm. As the 1870s progress, the first generation of morphine-dependent children approaches adulthood, carrying dependencies, trauma, and social damage that will affect British society for decades to come. Their stories reveal the devastating human cost of pharmaceutical marketing campaigns that prioritize profits over child welfare, while convincing loving parents to participate in systematic poisoning of their own children. The full scope of this tragedy extends far beyond individual families to encompass an entire generation whose development has been fundamentally altered by chemical intervention. These young adults enter Victorian society without natural coping mechanisms, authentic emotional experiences, or healthy relationship patterns, carrying forward the damage created through childhood pharmaceutical dependence into their own parenting practices and social interactions. The transformation of these chemically dependent adolescents into adults creates ripple effects that Victorian society cannot anticipate or contain. 20-year-old Thomas Hartwell emerges from 3 months in debtor's prison, carrying scars that extend far beyond his criminal record. His body, weakened by inconsistent access to morphine during incarceration, trembles constantly. His mind, never having developed natural resilience, fractures under stress in ways that terrify even hardened prison guards. Elizabeth waits for Thomas outside the prison gates, clutching a small bottle of Godfrey's cordial that represents her life savings. She has sold furniture, clothing, and even her wedding ring to purchase enough medication to ease Thomas's transition back into family life. The reunion between mother and son reveals the complete breakdown of normal human relationships when filtered through pharmaceutical dependency. Thomas cannot embrace his mother without first receiving his chemical relief. Elizabeth cannot express maternal love without enabling destructive addiction. Their interaction revolves entirely around drug administration, with authentic emotion replaced by transactional exchanges focused on chemical needs. The loving bond that once existed between them has been completely consumed by the pharmaceutical dependency that began with infant teething medicine 15 years earlier. The employment prospects for young adults carrying childhood pharmaceutical dependencies prove even more limited than their adolescent challenges suggested. Factory foremen like James Crowley develop increasingly sophisticated screening processes designed to identify and reject applicants displaying signs of chemical dependence. The industrial economy that created demand for infant sedation now refuses to accommodate the addicted adults those practices produced. Thomas's attempts to secure stable employment meet consistent failure as his medication requirements conflict with workplace demands. His tolerance levels now require doses every few hours, making full-time labor impossible without access to pharmaceutical supplies that employers refuse to accommodate. The withdrawal symptoms that emerge during work shifts create safety hazards that supervisors cannot ignore, leading to rapid termination from every position he attempts. The economic exclusion of morphine-dependent young adults creates new categories of urban poverty that Victorian social reformers struggle to understand. William Whitmore, now 18 years old, represents thousands of young men whose pharmaceutical dependencies render them unemployable despite physical capability and desperate willingness to work. His family faces destitution as William's medication costs continue consuming household resources, while his inability to contribute income creates additional financial strain. Sarah Whitmore's decision to dilute William's morphine preparations with increasingly dangerous substances reflects the desperation driving families beyond the boundaries of rational pharmaceutical management. Her attempts to extend inadequate drug supplies using alcohol, laudanum, and even industrial chemicals create new health risks, while failing to address William's escalating tolerance and withdrawal symptoms. The underground pharmaceutical networks serving adult morphine dependencies operate with sophisticated distribution systems that would impress modern drug enforcement officials. Former patients connect with suppliers through elaborate referral networks that span multiple cities, creating shadow economies worth thousands of pounds annually while operating completely outside legal regulation or medical supervision. Margaret Collins discovers these illegal pharmaceutical markets through her son's connections with other young adults carrying childhood medication histories. Her initial horror at purchasing morphine preparations from criminal suppliers gradually transforms into routine acceptance as she recognizes that legal alternatives cannot meet her son's chemical needs without bankrupting her family. The normalization of criminal pharmaceutical activity among respectable middle-class families reveals how completely childhood medication practices have corrupted traditional moral boundaries. Parents who would never consider illegal activities in other contexts become sophisticated drug purchasers, dealers, and distributors when their children's chemical needs demand criminal solutions. Emma Blackwood's surviving children follow predictable trajectories into adult pharmaceutical dependence that consume her remaining financial resources while providing diminishing returns in terms of behavioral stability. Her 17-year-old son requires morphine preparations so strong that she must purchase them from suppliers who operate floating laboratories on the Thames, mixing industrial chemicals with pharmaceutical compounds to create products powerful enough to satisfy advanced tolerance levels. The floating laboratories represent the inevitable evolution of childhood pharmaceutical markets into sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploit parental desperation while creating increasingly dangerous products. These operations combine morphine with cocaine, alcohol, and various industrial chemicals to produce preparations that provide temporary relief while accelerating physical deterioration and psychological breakdown. Emma's monthly journeys to the Thames docks illustrate the complete transformation of loving mothers into desperate drug purchasers willing to risk arrest, violence, and financial ruin to maintain their children's chemical dependencies. Her careful evaluation of product quality, supply reliability, and pricing strategies demonstrates expertise that rivals professional pharmaceutical knowledge while operating entirely outside legal frameworks. The social isolation accompanying adult pharmaceutical dependence creates communities of families sharing similar struggles while maintaining facades of respectability that conceal their criminal pharmaceutical activities. Neighborhood networks develop around shared drug suppliers, bulk purchasing arrangements, and mutual support during law enforcement crackdowns that threaten community pharmaceutical security. Elizabeth Hartwell's friendship circle now consists entirely of mothers whose adult children require illegal pharmaceutical support. Their social gatherings revolve around sharing information about supplier reliability, product quality, and pricing trends while maintaining careful secrecy about their criminal pharmaceutical activities. These women have transformed from respectable Victorian mothers into sophisticated drug distribution networks that operate with military-like precision and security protocols. The medical establishment's response to growing evidence of adult pharmaceutical addiction involves increasingly desperate attempts to maintain professional credibility while protecting industry relationships that generate substantial consulting income. Dr. Richardson's latest publications introduce complex theoretical frameworks that attribute adult drug problems to moral degeneracy, rather than acknowledging the iatrogenic origins of pharmaceutical dependence created through childhood medication practices. The concept of constitutional addiction emerges as the preferred medical explanation for adult morphine dependence that avoids implicating childhood pharmaceutical marketing in creating widespread drug problems. This theory suggests that certain individuals possess inherited tendencies toward pharmaceutical abuse that manifest regardless of medical intervention, effectively absolving physicians of responsibility for prescribing practices that create lifelong dependencies. Medical conferences throughout Britain feature presentations describing genetic predisposition to pharmaceutical addiction, while carefully avoiding discussion of dosage relationships, withdrawal phenomena, or childhood medication histories that might implicate standard prescribing practices in creating adult drug problems. The medical profession develops elaborate intellectual frameworks designed to obscure rather than illuminate the connections between infant medication and adult addiction. Dr. Margaret Foster's continued research into childhood pharmaceutical damage faces increasingly sophisticated opposition from medical colleagues whose careers depend on maintaining industry relationships. Her attempts to publish findings linking infant medication practices to adult addiction meet editorial resistance from journals that rely on pharmaceutical advertising revenue and industry-sponsored research grants. Foster's professional isolation demonstrates the powerful economic interests protecting childhood pharmaceutical practices from scientific scrutiny. Her medical license faces review proceedings initiated by colleagues who argue that her research threatens public health by discouraging parents from using beneficial medical treatments for their children. The persecution of medical professionals who question pharmaceutical practices extends beyond professional consequences to include personal threats and financial sabotage designed to silence criticism of childhood medication campaigns. Foster's private practice loses patients after organized campaigns. Questioning her competence and medical judgments circulate through community networks, influenced by pharmaceutical industry representatives. Meanwhile, the human consequences of adult pharmaceutical dependence continue devastating families across Britain, as young adults carrying childhood medication histories prove incapable of forming healthy relationships, maintaining employment, or participating normally in social institutions. Their dependencies create cascading effects that influence marriage patterns, family formation, and intergenerational transmission of pharmaceutical problems. Thomas Hartwell's attempt to court Mary Peterson illustrates the relationship challenges facing morphine-dependent young adults whose chemical needs interfere with normal romantic development. Thomas cannot participate in evening social activities without access to his medication schedule, cannot plan future commitments around unpredictable withdrawal episodes, and cannot provide emotional while stability managing constant pharmaceutical crises. Mary Peterson's initial attraction to Thomas's quiet demeanor gradually transforms into concern as she recognizes his dependence on mysterious medical treatments that seem to govern aspect of his daily every routine. Her attempts to understand Thomas's pharmaceutical needs meet resistance from Elizabeth, who has learned to conceal her son's addiction from potential romantic partners through elaborate deception strategies. The deception required to maintain appearances of normalcy while managing adult pharmaceutical dependencies creates additional psychological stress for families already struggling with chemical addiction issues. Parents develop sophisticated lying techniques designed to protect their children's romantic prospects while concealing the extent of their pharmaceutical problems from potential marriage partners. Elizabeth's coaching helps Thomas maintain his courtship with Mary through careful timing of social interactions around his medication schedule and strategic concealment of his drug supplies during romantic encounters. The relationship requires constant pharmaceutical management that transforms natural romantic development into elaborate theatrical performance designed to hide chemical dependency. Mary's discovery of Thomas's morphine addiction during an unexpected withdrawal episode triggers relationship crisis that illuminates the impossible challenges facing drug-dependent young adults seeking normal romantic connections. Her horror at witnessing Thomas's violent withdrawal symptoms destroys any possibility of future romantic development while confirming Elizabeth's fears about social consequences of pharmaceutical honesty. The romantic failures experienced by morphine-dependent young adults create additional isolation that compounds their chemical addiction with profound loneliness and social rejection. Their inability to form healthy relationships eliminates natural support systems that might help address addiction issues while reinforcing pharmaceutical dependence as their primary coping mechanism for emotional distress. William Whitmore's complete social isolation by age 19 reflects the comprehensive rejection that awaits young adults whose childhood pharmaceutical dependencies have evolved into unmanageable addictions. His inability to maintain employment, romantic relationships, or family connections leaves him entirely dependent on pharmaceutical relief for any sense of emotional stability or social connection. Sarah's recognition that William will never achieve independence forces her to confront the reality that her loving attempts to medicate his childhood challenges have created a lifetime dependent who will require constant pharmaceutical and financial support until death. The promise of temporary relief that attracted her to infant medication has transformed into permanent responsibility for managing uncontrollable addiction. The financial burden of supporting adult pharmaceutical dependencies proves unsustainable for most working-class families, whose resources cannot accommodate the escalating costs of illegal morphine preparations required by highly tolerant users. Families face impossible choices between maintaining their addicted children's chemical needs and providing basic necessities for other family members. Emma Blackwood's decision to commit her surviving son to a private asylum represents the desperate final option chosen by parents who cannot afford continued pharmaceutical support while recognizing that withdrawal attempts have failed repeatedly. The asylum's promise of medical supervision during detoxification offers hope for breaking chemical dependencies that have resisted all family intervention efforts. The private asylums accepting morphine-dependent patients operate with treatment philosophies that combine moral rehabilitation with gradual pharmaceutical reduction, promising families that professional medical supervision can accomplish what parental intervention cannot achieve. These institutions charge substantial fees while providing questionable treatment outcomes that often result in patient death or permanent institutionalization rather than successful recovery. Emma's monthly visits to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital reveal the horrific conditions facing morphine-dependent patients whose families cannot afford continued pharmaceutical support. Her son exists in a twilight state between withdrawal agony and chemical sedation, receiving just enough medication to prevent death while experiencing constant suffering that makes recovery seem impossible. The asylum's treatment approach involves replacing morphine with alcohol and various experimental pharmaceutical combinations that create new dependencies while failing to address underlying addiction issues. Patients become testing subjects for untested chemical interventions that often prove more dangerous than their original pharmaceutical dependencies. Emma's growing recognition that institutionalization represents abandonment rather than treatment forces her to confront the complete absence of effective medical interventions for addiction problems created through childhood pharmaceutical marketing. The medical establishment that created these dependencies through infant medication campaigns offers no solutions for the adult addiction problems that inevitably result from their prescribing practices. The suicide rate among morphine-dependent young adults reaches alarming levels as individuals recognize the hopelessness of their pharmaceutical dependencies while lacking access to effective treatment or social support. Their deaths often go unrecorded as addiction-related fatalities, instead being attributed to accidental overdoses or mysterious medical conditions that obscure the systematic nature of pharmaceutical harm affecting thousands of British families. Thomas Hartwell's death at age 21 represents the predictable conclusion of childhood pharmaceutical dependence that began with legitimate medical treatment for infant teething pain. His final overdose occurs during a desperate attempt to self-medicate withdrawal symptoms using industrial morphine preparations purchased from Thames dock suppliers who mix pharmaceutical compounds with dangerous chemical adulterants. Elizabeth's discovery of Thomas's body reveals the complete failure of every intervention strategy she attempted throughout his pharmaceutical dependence. Her 15 years of devoted medication management, financial sacrifice, and family disruption culminate in the loss of the child she tried so desperately to help through chemical means. The coroner's report attributes Thomas's death to accidental poisoning from contaminated pharmaceutical preparations, avoiding any discussion of his childhood medication history or the role of legitimate medical treatments in creating his fatal addiction. The official silence surrounding pharmaceutical causation allows the medical establishment to maintain credibility while continuing profitable childhood medication practices despite mounting evidence of their deadly consequences. Elizabeth's grief transforms into rage as she recognizes the systematic deception that convinced her to begin Thomas's pharmaceutical dependence through infant medication campaigns that promised safety while delivering death. Her attempts to seek accountability through legal channels meet resistance from authorities who refuse to acknowledge connections between childhood medication practices and adult addiction fatalities. The legal challenges facing families seeking pharmaceutical accountability reveal the sophisticated protection systems safeguarding childhood medication commerce from liability claims. Industry lawyers argue that morphine-based remedies represent legitimate medical treatments whose proper use prevents rather than causes addiction problems, effectively blaming victims while protecting manufacturer profits. Elizabeth's lawsuit against the Anglo-American drug company represents the first serious legal challenge to childhood pharmaceutical marketing practices that create lifelong dependencies leading to death. Her case demands accountability for advertising campaigns that deliberately concealed addiction risks while targeting vulnerable mothers desperate for childcare solutions. The pharmaceutical industry's response involves legal strategies designed to establish precedents protecting manufacturers from liability for properly marketed medical products used according to professional medical recommendations. Company attorneys argue that addiction problems reflect consumer misuse rather than product defects or misleading marketing practices. The legal battle reveals the extensive coordination between pharmaceutical manufacturers, medical professionals, and regulatory authorities designed to protect childhood medication practices from accountability while maintaining appearances of scientific objectivity and medical ethics. Industry influence extends throughout British legal and medical institutions, creating systematic resistance to challenges threatening profitable pharmaceutical markets. Elizabeth's case attracts support from other mothers whose children have died from pharmaceutical complications, creating the first organised opposition to childhood medication practices that have operated without accountability for decades. Their coalition represents families across social classes, united by shared experiences of pharmaceutical loss and systematic medical deception. The emerging pharmaceutical reform movement faces enormous challenges from established interests that have built fortunes on childhood addiction while maintaining social respectability through medical endorsement and charitable activities. The industry's wealth enables sophisticated opposition campaigns designed to discredit reform advocates while preserving profitable medication practices. Sarah Whitmore's decision to join Elizabeth's legal challenge represents the transformation of grieving mothers into political activists determined to prevent other families from experiencing pharmaceutical tragedies that destroyed their own children. Her testimony describing William's pharmaceutical history provides compelling evidence of systematic harm created through childhood medication practices. The coalition of pharmaceutical reform advocates grows to include medical professionals like Dr. Foster, who risk professional destruction to expose the deadly consequences of childhood medication campaigns they once supported. Their combined testimony creates unprecedented public awareness of pharmaceutical harm, while challenging the medical establishment's credibility and authority. The pharmaceutical industry's counterattack involves sophisticated public relations campaigns designed to portray reform advocates as dangerous extremists who would deny children access to beneficial medical treatments. Industry-sponsored publications emphasize the safety and necessity of childhood pharmaceutical interventions, while attacking critics as irresponsible radicals threatening child accountability welfare. The battle over childhood pharmaceutical represents a fundamental conflict between commercial interests that profit from addiction and family interests that prioritize child welfare over pharmaceutical profits. The outcome will determine whether British society continues accepting systematic poisoning of children or develops effective protections against pharmaceutical exploitation of parental desperation. As the 1870s conclude, the first generation of morphine-dependent children has revealed the devastating long-term consequences of pharmaceutical infant marketing campaigns that transform care into systematic drug administration. Their stories of addiction, exclus, socialien, criminal involvement, and premature death provide undeniable evidence of harm that can no longer be concealed through medical authority or commercial influence. The mothers who once trusted pharmaceutical companies and medical professionals with their children's welfare now understand the systematic deception that convinced them to participate in poisoning their own offspring. Their transformation from grateful consumers into determined reformers represents hope that future generations might be protected from pharmaceutical exploitation, accountability through regulation, and truthful medical information. The tragedy of Victorian England's addicted mothers and poisoned children serves as a warning about the dangers of unregulated pharmaceutical marketing, combined with medical authority that prioritizes commercial relationships over patient welfare. Their suffering demonstrates how easily loving parents can be manipulated into harming their children when desperate circumstances meet misleading marketing and professional endorsement of dangerous practices. The legacy of this pharmaceutical catastrophe extends far beyond individual family tragedies to encompass fundamental questions about medical ethics, commercial responsibility, and social protection of vulnerable populations. The children who survive their pharmaceutical dependencies carry forward trauma and damage that will influence British society for generations, while the mothers who lost children to pharmaceutical addiction create reform movements that challenge established medical and the battle-authorityed commercial for pharmaceutical accountability in Victorian England represents the beginning of ongoing struggles between commercial interests that profit from chemical dependence and reform movements that prioritize human welfare over pharmaceutical profits. The courage of mothers like Elizabeth Hartwell and Sarah Whitmore in challenging powerful industries while grieving their own losses creates foundations for future protections against pharmaceutical exploitation of parental desperation. Their stories remind us that the most dangerous threats to children often come disguised as helpful solutions endorsed by trusted authorities, and that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance against commercial interests that prioritize profits over human welfare. The addicted mothers and poisoned children of Victorian England paid the ultimate price for society's failure to question pharmaceutical marketing claims and medical endorsements that promised relief while delivering destruction. As we enter the 1880s, a new generation of reformers emerges from the ashes of pharmaceutical tragedy, but their fight faces opposition that extends far beyond corporate boardrooms into the highest levels of British government and society. The web of complicity surrounding infant morphine administration reaches depths that shock even the most cynical observers. Lord Pemberton, whose wife Catherine maintained that elaborate nursery medicine cabinet, sits on the Parliamentary Committee for Public Health, while simultaneously holding substantial investments in 3 major pharmaceutical companies producing infant remedies. His dual role as public health advocate and private pharmaceutical investor creates conflicts of interest that epitomize the systematic corruption protecting childhood medication practices from meaningful regulation. When Elizabeth Hartwell's legal case gains public attention, Lord Pemberton uses his parliamentary influence to commission studies designed to vindicate childhood pharmaceutical practices, while Dice's investigation redditing reform advocates. His committee employs medical experts whose research funding comes directly from pharmaceutical companies, ensuring conclusions that support continued infant medication despite mounting evidence of harm. The parliamentary hearings reveal the sophisticated machinery protecting pharmaceutical interests from accountability. Witness testimony follows carefully orchestrated scripts that emphasize the benefits of childhood medication while dismissing addiction evidence as coincidental correlation rather than systematic causation. Medical experts present complex statistical analyses that obscure rather than illuminate the connections between infant medication and adult addiction. Dr. Richardson's testimony before Parliament represents the medical establishment's coordinated defence of childhood pharmaceutical practices. His presentation describes infant morphine preparations as essential medical interventions that prevent rather than cause addiction problems, arguing that withdrawal from beneficial treatments creates the behavioural problems that uninformed observers mistakenly attribute to pharmaceutical dependence. Richardson's sophisticated deception involves redefining addiction symptoms as evidence of underlying medical conditions that require continued pharmaceutical treatment rather than withdrawal from harmful substances. His testimony transforms Thomas Hartwell's death from pharmaceutical overdose into tragic outcome of inadequate medication management, rather than predictable consequence of childhood addiction created through medical recommendation. The Parliamentary Committee's final report endorses continued childhood pharmaceutical practices, while recommending minor labelling changes that fail to address fundamental problems of infant addiction and parental deception. Lord Pemberton's influence ensures that regulatory recommendations protect industry profits, while creating appearances of government concern for child welfare. Elizabeth's response to the parliamentary whitewash involves organising public demonstrations that attract thousands of mothers whose children have suffered pharmaceutical harm. Their protests outside Parliament buildings create unprecedented public awareness of childhood medication dangers, while challenging the political establishment's commitment to pharmaceutical interests over family welfare. The demonstrations reveal the geographic scope of pharmaceutical damage as mothers travel from across Britain to share stories of children lost to medication practices endorsed by trusted medical authorities. Their collective testimony creates a compelling narrative of systematic harm that cannot be dismissed through statistical manipulation or medical authority. Margaret Collins addresses the crowd with devastating testimony about her son's pharmaceutical history and her own complicity in creating his addiction through loving adherence to medical recommendations. Her speech transforms personal grief into political action as she demands accountability from manufacturers, physicians, and government officials who profited from childhood suffering. The crowd's response to Margaret's testimony demonstrates the power of shared experience in creating political movements that challenge established authority. Mothers who previously blamed themselves for their children's problems recognize their participation in systematic deception that exploited parental love while generating enormous profits for pharmaceutical companies. Emma Blackwood's presence at the demonstration, despite her daughter's death and son's institutionalization, represents the transformation of individual tragedy into collective resistance. Her decision to speak publicly about her family's pharmaceutical destruction requires enormous courage, given the social stigma addiction and the economic interests surrounding threatened testimony. Emad, by her speech, reveals the financial mechanisms through which pharmaceutical companies targeted working-class mothers with payment plans and bulk purchasing options families that enable to maintain their children's drug dependencies even during economic crises. Her detailed knowledge of industry marketing strategies provides compelling evidence of deliberate addiction creation rather than accidental pharmaceutical misuse. The government's response to growing public pressure involves cosmetic regulatory changes that appear to address pharmaceutical concerns while preserving industry profits and medical authority. New labeling requirements mandate disclosure of morphine content in infant remedies, but fail to restrict sales or require medical supervision for potentially addictive substances. The labeling requirements create an illusion of pharmaceutical reform, while actually legitimizing continued infant medication through official acknowledgement that morphine-based preparations represent acceptable medical treatments when used with proper awareness of their contents. Parents who continue using these products after reading warning labels cannot claim ignorance about potential risks. Sarah Whitmore's reaction to the new labeling requirements reveals the inadequacy of informational approaches to addressing systematic pharmaceutical exploitation. Her ability to read and understand morphine content warnings means nothing when her surviving children require continued medication to prevent withdrawal symptoms that threaten their basic functioning and family stability. The reformed labels actually increase Sarah's anxiety about her family's pharmaceutical dependence by confirming the dangerous nature of substances she cannot eliminate from their daily routines without triggering withdrawal crises that might prove fatal. Knowledge about morphine content provides no practical solutions for families trapped in pharmaceutical dependencies created through medical recommendation. The pharmaceutical industry adapts to new labeling requirements by reformulating products to reduce disclosed morphine content, while adding other addictive substances that accomplish similar sedative effects without triggering warning label requirements. Their chemical innovation maintains product effectiveness while appearing to address regulatory concerns. Dalby's Carminative introduces a new formulation that replaces some morphine content with cocaine and alcohol, creating preparations that produce desired behavioral effects while technically complying with morphine disclosure requirements. The reformulation actually increases addiction potential while providing legal protection against false advertising claims. The reformulated products create new categories of pharmaceutical dependence that combine multiple addictive substances in ways that complicate withdrawal and treatment efforts. Children who become dependent on cocaine-enhanced preparations face polysubstance addictions that prove even more difficult to address than simple morphine dependence. Dr. Foster's analysis of reformulated pharmaceutical products reveals the industry's sophisticated understanding of addiction chemistry and their willingness to exploit regulatory loopholes while maintaining profitable childhood medication markets. Her research demonstrates that labeling reforms have actually increased rather than decreased the addiction potential of popular infant remedies. Foster's findings about pharmaceutical reformulation trigger new waves of public outrage as parents recognize that regulatory victories have been manipulated to create more dangerous rather than safer products for their children. The industry's cynical response to reform efforts galvanizes opposition movements while exposing the inadequacy of regulatory approaches that fail to address fundamental commercial incentives. The medical establishment's response to growing criticism involves developing new theoretical frameworks that legitimize continued childhood pharmaceutical practices while appearing to address public concerns about addiction. The concept of therapeutic dependencies as dents a supposedly scientific distinction between harmful addiction and beneficial medical reliance on pharmaceutical substances. Dr. Richardson's latest publications argue that children who require continued morphine administration from chronic suffer medical conditions that necessitate permanent pharmaceutical management rather than temporary treatments that created harmful dependencies. His therapeutic dependence theory reframes addiction as evidence of successful medical intervention rather than harmful pharmaceutical exploitation. The therapeutic dependence concept gains acceptance among physicians who need intellectual justification for continuing profitable prescribing practices despite mounting evidence of harm. Medical conferences feature presentations describing the benefits of recognizing pharmaceutical dependence as legitimate medical treatment rather than problematic addiction requiring intervention. This medical reframing of addiction as therapy creates new obstacles for families seeking help with their children's pharmaceutical dependencies. Parents who request assistance with withdrawal face medical resistance based on theoretical frameworks that define their children's chemical needs as evidence of underlying medical conditions requiring continued treatment rather than harmful dependencies demanding elimination. Thomas Hartwell's younger brother, James, now 15 years old, exemplifies the ongoing cycle of pharmaceutical dependence that continues despite regulatory reforms and public awareness campaigns. His addiction began before birth, as Elizabeth's morphine used during pregnancy created prenatal dependence that required immediate postnatal medication to prevent withdrawal symptoms that might have proved fatal. James's case illustrates how childhood pharmaceutical practices have evolved to encompass prenatal medication that creates dependencies before birth, expanding pharmaceutical markets while complicating addiction timelines that begin in the womb rather than during infancy. His dependence cannot be attributed to parental decisions about infant medication because his addiction preceded conscious existence. Elizabeth's recognition that James's addiction began during pregnancy forces her to confront additional dimensions of pharmaceutical harm that extend beyond childhood medication into prenatal pharmaceutical exposure. Her guilt about creating addiction through pregnancy medication compounds her grief about Thomas's death. while complicating her activism against pharmaceutical companies. The discovery of prenatal pharmaceutical addiction opens new legal avenues for challenging childhood medication practices by demonstrating that addiction creation begins during pregnancy rather than after birth. Elizabeth's expanded lawsuit includes prenatal pharmaceutical exposure as evidence of systematic harm that encompasses entire reproductive cycles rather than discrete medication decisions. The pharmaceutical industry's response to prenatal addiction claims involves sophisticated legal arguments that pregnancy medication represents separate medical treatment unrelated to childhood pharmaceutical practices. Company lawyers argue that prenatal morphine use addresses legitimate medical needs during pregnancy, rather than creating intentional addiction in developing fetuses. The legal battle over prenatal pharmaceutical responsibility reveals additional layers of medical complicity in creating widespread addiction through routine obstetric practices that involve regular morphine administration during pregnancy and childbirth. The medical establishment's endorsement of pregnancy medication practices creates systematic prenatal addiction that guarantees postnatal pharmaceutical markets. Dr. Foster's research into prenatal pharmaceutical exposure reveals that virtually every child mothers using born to pregnancy carries based remedies during morphine dependencies that require immediate chemical postnatal medication to prevent potentially fatal withdrawal symptoms. Her findings demonstrate that childhood pharmaceutical markets depend on prenatal addiction creation, rather than parental choice about infant medication. The prenatal addiction research creates new categories of pharmaceutical victims who never experienced addiction-free existence and cannot be expected to function normally without chemical assistance. These individuals represent the ultimate success of pharmaceutical marketing campaigns that create lifetime dependencies beginning before conscious existence. James Hartwell's complete inability to imagine life without pharmaceutical assistance illustrates the psychological impact of prenatal addiction that creates dependencies preceding memory, personality formation, and conscious decision-making. His identity formation occurs entirely within pharmaceutical dependence that defines his understanding of normal human experience. Elizabeth's attempts to discuss pharmaceutical reduction with James meet resistance from someone who cannot comprehend existence without chemical assistance because his entire conscious experience has occurred within morphine dependence. His terror at the prospect of medication reduction reflects genuine inability to imagine authentic human experience rather than simple preference for pharmaceutical assistance. The philosophical implications of prenatal pharmaceutical addiction challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature, free ethics by will, and medical individuals creating whose personalities, preferences, and behaviors have been shaped entirely by chemical intervention preceding conscious choice. James represents a new category of human being whose authentic self has never existed, independent of pharmaceutical influence. The medical establishment's response to prenatal addiction research involves denying the possibility that pharmaceutical exposure during pregnancy creates meaningful chemical dependence in developing fetuses. Physicians argue that prenatal morphine administration addresses legitimate medical needs without creating harmful dependencies that persist after birth. Dr. Richardson's latest theoretical framework describes prenatal pharmaceutical exposure as beneficial medical intervention that prepares developing fetuses for postnatal pharmaceutical treatment of inherited medical conditions that would otherwise cause suffering. His argument transforms prenatal addiction from harmful exploitation into compassionate medical preparation for necessary lifelong treatment. The prenatal preparation theory legitimizes childhood pharmaceutical dependence by suggesting that addiction represents successful medical intervention rather than harmful commercial exploitation. This framework allows physicians to continue profitable prescribing practices while claiming scientific justification for creating chemical dependencies that generate lifetime pharmaceutical markets. Meanwhile, the human cost of pharmaceutical dependence continues devastating families, as young adults carrying childhood medication histories prove incapable of forming healthy relationships, maintaining employment, or participating normally in social institutions. Their chemical dependencies create cascading effects that influence marriage patterns, family formation, and intergenerational transmission of pharmaceutical problems. William Whitmore's complete social isolation by age 21 forces Sarah to confront the reality that her son will never achieve independence or contribute meaningfully to family or community welfare. His pharmaceutical dependence has consumed family resources while preventing him from developing adult capabilities that might justify continued support. Sarah's decision to abandon William represents the desperate final choice faced by parents whose financial resources cannot sustain adult pharmaceutical dependencies while meeting basic survival needs for other family members. Her choice between William's chemical needs and family survival illustrates the impossible situations created by childhood medication practices. William's abandonment triggers a downward spiral that leads to criminal activity, prostitution, and eventual death from contaminated pharmaceutical preparations purchased from street suppliers who mix morphine with dangerous adulterants to maximize profits while serving desperate addicted customers. His death occurs in a Thameside opium den that represents the inevitable destination for morphine-dependent individuals whose families cannot afford continued pharmaceutical support through legal channels. The den's clientele consists largely of young adults whose childhood medication histories created dependencies that evolved into criminal pharmaceutical markets. Sarah's discovery of William's death through police notification completes her transformation from loving mother who trusted medical authority into bitter opponent of pharmaceutical interests that destroyed her family while generating enormous profits. Her testimony at William's inquest provides devastating evidence of systematic harm created through childhood medication practices. The coroner's reluctance to record William's death as pharmaceutical addiction reflects official policies designed to minimize public awareness of systematic harm while protecting medical and commercial interests from accountability. His death certificate lists accidental poisoning rather than predictable outcome of childhood pharmaceutical dependence. Sarah's legal challenge to the inquest findings attracts support from growing networks of mothers whose children have died from pharmaceutical complications, creating unprecedented pressure for official acknowledgement of systematic harm rather than individual tragedies attributed to accidental poisoning or moral weakness. The Coalition of Pharmaceutical Reform Advocates expands to include middle-class families whose children have experienced addiction problems despite financial resources that enabled continued medication through legal channels. Their participation demonstrates that pharmaceutical harm transcends economic boundaries while affecting families across social classes. Lady Catherine Pemberton's decision to join the reform movement after her own son's pharmaceutical overdose represents a crucial breakthrough in challenging upper-class support for childhood medication practices. Her social position provides credibility that working-class mothers cannot achieve, while her wealth enables legal challenges that poorer families cannot afford. Catherine's testimony about her elaborate nursery pharmaceutical management reveals the sophisticated medication practices employed by wealthy families who believed their financial resources could prevent pharmaceutical problems through superior medical supervision and higher quality preparations. Her son's death, despite every possible advantage, demonstrates that pharmaceutical addiction creates risks that transcend social class. The participation of upper-class mothers in pharmaceutical reform movements creates new political dynamics that challenge government officials who previously dismissed working-class complaints as evidence of moral weakness rather than systematic exploitation. Catherine's social connections provide access to political influence that enables meaningful regulatory challenges. Lord Pemberton's conflict between his wife's reform activism and his pharmaceutical investments creates family tensions that mirror broader social divisions over childhood medication practices. His attempts to maintain both political credibility and commercial profits become increasingly difficult as public awareness of pharmaceutical harm grows through organized reform campaigns. Catherine's threat to publicly expose her husband's pharmaceutical investments, unless he supports meaningful reform, creates personal leverage that transcends political considerations. Her willingness to sacrifice family harmony for pharmaceutical accountability demonstrates the powerful motivations driving mothers who have lost children to medication practices they once trusted. The political battle over pharmaceutical accountability reaches critical intensity as reform movements gain influence while industry interests mobilize sophisticated opposition campaigns designed to preserve profitable childhood medication markets. The outcome will determine whether British society develops effective protections against pharmaceutical exploitation or continues accepting systematic poisoning of children through commercially motivated medical practices. Dr. Foster's latest research reveals that pharmaceutical companies have begun developing new marketing strategies designed to exploit emerging awareness of addiction risks while maintaining profitable childhood medication sales. Their campaigns emphasize parental responsibility for managing pharmaceutical risks while portraying continued medication as evidence of superior parenting rather than harmful dependence. The industry's adaptive marketing demonstrates sophisticated understanding of public psychology and regulatory dynamics that enable continued exploitation of parental desperation while appearing to address safety concerns. Their ability to transform criticism into marketing opportunities reveals the challenges facing reform movements that seek meaningful change rather than cosmetic adjustments. Elizabeth Hartwell's recognition that pharmaceutical reform requires fundamental changes in medical education, regulatory authority, and commercial accountability rather than minor labeling adjustments leads her to establish the Society for the Protection of Children from Pharmaceutical Exploitation. The organization's comprehensive approach addresses systematic rather than superficial aspects of childhood medication practices. The Society's influence grows rapidly as mothers across Britain recognise the need for coordinated action against pharmaceutical interests that have successfully resisted individual challenges through superior resources and political influence. Their collective action creates unprecedented pressure for meaningful reform, while providing mutual support for families dealing with pharmaceutical addiction. Sarah Whitmore's appointment as the Society's first president reflects her transformation from grieving mother into effective political organizer whose personal experience with pharmaceutical tragedy provides credibility and motivation for sustained reform efforts. Her leadership demonstrates how personal loss can be transformed into social change through organized political action. The Society's first annual conference attracts hundreds of mothers whose children have experienced pharmaceutical harm, creating a powerful demonstration of systematic damage that cannot be dismissed as isolated incidents or individual failures. Their collective testimony provides undeniable evidence of widespread harm that demands immediate regulatory response. The pharmaceutical industry's response to organized reform movements involves sophisticated campaigns designed to divide opposition through targeted attacks on individual leaders, while portraying reform advocates as extremists who threaten child welfare through opposition to beneficial medical treatments. Their strategy seeks to isolate radical activists while maintaining mainstream support for childhood medication practices. Elizabeth's response to industry attacks involves expanding the Reform Coalition to include medical professionals, religious leaders, and social reformers who provide credibility and political influence that transcends maternal activism. Her strategic approach recognizes that sustainable change requires broad social support rather than single-issue advocacy. The battle for pharmaceutical accountability in Victorian England reaches a decisive moment as reform movements gain political influence while industry interests mobilize every available resource to preserve profitable childhood medication markets. The stakes involve not only immediate child welfare, but fundamental questions about medical ethics, commercial responsibility, and social protection of vulnerable populations that will influence British society for generations to come. As the 1880s progress, the first generation of pharmaceutical reform advocates begins achieving meaningful victories against childhood medication practices that have operated without accountability for decades. Their success demonstrates that organized political action can challenge even the most powerful commercial interests when motivated by parental love and sustain through collective determination to protect future generations from pharmaceutical exploitation. The mothers who transformed personal tragedy into social reform have created lasting institutions and legal precedents that provide foundations for ongoing protection against pharmaceutical exploitation of parental desperation. Their courage in challenging medical authority and commercial power while grieving their own losses represents one of the most remarkable examples of social reform emerging from personal tragedy in Victorian Britain. Their legacy reminds future generations that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance against commercial interests that prioritize profits over human welfare, and that the most dangerous threats to children often come disguised as helpful solutions endorsed by trusted authorities. The addicted mothers and poisoned children of Victorian England paid the ultimate price for society's failure to question pharmaceutical marketing claims. But their sacrifice created protections that would prevent future generations from experiencing similar systematic exploitation and tragedy. The transformation of pharmaceutical accountability movements from isolated maternal grief into organized political force creates unprecedented challenges for an industry accustomed to operating without meaningful oversight. By 1883, the Society for the Protection of Children from Pharmaceutical Exploitation has established chapters in 17 major British cities, each led by mothers whose personal losses fuel relentless advocacy for systemic change. Margaret Davies, the Cardiff mother whose 6-month-old daughter died after 3 weeks of regular syrup use, emerges as the Society's most effective organiser in Wales. Her ability to connect with working-class mothers while maintaining relationships with middle-class supporters creates powerful coalitions that transcend traditional social boundaries in pursuit of pharmaceutical accountability. Margaret's organising strategy involves house-to-house visits in industrial neighbourhoods, where childhood pharmaceutical dependence has become normalised through generations of poverty-driven desperation. Her conversations with mothers reveal the extent to which entire communities have structured their daily routines around medication schedules that govern children's behaviour from birth through adolescence. During one particularly revealing conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Frost, a factory worker's wife in Swansea, Margaret discovers that Eleanor maintains medication schedules for 7 children ranging in age from 6 months to 14 years. Each child receives different preparations at different times, according to elaborate protocols that Eleanor has developed through years of careful observation and community consultation. Eleanor's pharmaceutical management system represents the sophisticated knowledge that working-class mothers have developed about morphine-based preparations and their effects on childhood behaviour of DEWs. Her detailed understanding, age calculations, timing interactions, and tolerance management would impress modern addiction specialists, yet operates entirely outside medical supervision or safety protocols. The tragedy of Eleanor's expertise lies in her genuine belief that her pharmaceutical management represents superior mothering compared to women who allow their children to experience discomfort without chemical intervention. Her pride in maintaining peaceful, compliant children through chemical means reflects the complete inversion of maternal instincts that pharmaceutical marketing has achieved throughout British working-class communities. Margaret's documentation of Eleanor's medication practices provides compelling evidence of systematic pharmaceutical dependence that affects entire families across multiple generations. Eleanor's oldest daughter, now pregnant with her first child, has already begun purchasing infant remedies in preparation for continuing pharmaceutical practices that she learned through childhood observation. The intergenerational transmission of childhood medication practices represents the pharmaceutical industry's ultimate success in creating self-perpetuating markets that transcend individual consumer decisions. Eleanor's daughter cannot imagine raising children without chemical assistance because her entire understanding of motherhood has been shaped by pharmaceutical dependence that appeared normal and necessary throughout her own childhood. Margaret's efforts to educate Eleanor about pharmaceutical risks meet resistance from someone whose economic survival depends on maintaining children's behavioural compliance through chemical means. Eleanor's factory employment requires absolute reliability that becomes impossible when children experience normal developmental challenges without pharmaceutical suppression. The economic coercion underlying childhood pharmaceutical dependence reveals how industrial capitalism has created conditions that make chemical child management seem rational despite its devastating long-term consequences. Eleanor's choice between pharmaceutical child management and economic catastrophe illustrates the systematic pressures that transform loving mothers into unwitting drug dealers. Margaret's recognition that meaningful pharmaceutical reform requires addressing economic conditions that create demand for chemical child management leads her to develop comprehensive advocacy strategies that challenge industrial labor practices alongside pharmaceutical marketing. Her approach recognizes that childhood medication serves economic functions that must be addressed through systemic rather than individual solutions. The Society's expansion into economic advocacy creates new alliances with labor organizations that recognize connections between workplace demands and childhood pharmaceutical dependence. Factory workers whose children require chemical management to accommodate industrial scheduling begin understanding how their employment conditions contribute to systematic child-through abuse, commercially motivated medication practices. James Henderson, a Sheffield steelworker whose wife maintains elaborate medication schedules for their 4 children, becomes an unexpected ally in pharmaceutical reform after recognizing how factory demands have transformed his family into pharmaceutical dependence. His testimony about the connections between industrial labor and childhood medication provides crucial male support for predominantly female reform movements. James's transformation from passive acceptance of childhood medication to active opposition reflects growing awareness among working-class fathers that pharmaceutical practices represent exploitation rather than medical progress. His willingness to challenge both industrial and pharmaceutical interests demonstrates the expanding social base for meaningful reform efforts. The inclusion of male voices in pharmaceutical reform movements creates new political dynamics that challenge industry claims that opposition comes from hysterical mothers rather than rational assessment of systematic harm. James's testimony about economic coercion underlying childhood medication provides credibility that transcends gender-based dismissal of maternal activism. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry adapts to growing opposition through increasingly sophisticated marketing campaigns designed to exploit class divisions within reform movements while portraying continued medication as scientific progress threatened by ignorant opposition. Their strategy involves promoting upper-class medical professionals who dismiss working-class concerns, while emphasizing the benefits of pharmaceutical intervention for proper child development. Dr. Montgomery Ashford, a prominent London paediatrician whose practice families EMA serves wealthy Jez as the industry's primary spokesman for defending childhood pharmaceutical practices against reform criticism. His aristocratic credentials and medical authority provide perfect cover for commercial interests, while his patient base demonstrates pharmaceutical success among families with resources for optimal medical supervision. Ashford's defense strategy involves acknowledging pharmaceutical risks, while arguing that proper medical supervision eliminates dangers that result from working-class ignorance rather than systematic product problems. His approach allows continued childhood medication while blaming addiction problems on inadequate medical oversight rather than inherent product characteristics. The class-based defense of pharmaceutical practices creates internal tensions within reform movements as working-class mothers recognize that wealthy families continue medicating their children while supporting restrictions on working-class access to similar treatments. This divide threatens coalition unity, while providing industry opportunities for exploiting social divisions. Lady Catherine Pemberton's response to class-based pharmaceutical arguments involves publicly documenting her own practices and families' medication, their tragic consequences despite optimal medical supervision and financial resources. Her testimony demonstrates that pharmaceutical addiction transcends economic boundaries while affecting children across all social classes. Catherine's willingness to expose her family's pharmaceutical failures requires enormous personal courage, given the social stigma surrounding addiction and the potential damage to her husband's political career. Her decision to prioritize pharmaceutical accountability over family reputation provides crucial evidence that addiction problems stem from product characteristics rather than consumer inadequacy. The revelation that wealthy families experience pharmaceutical addiction despite superior resources and medical supervision destroys industry arguments that childhood medication becomes problematic only through working-class misuse. Catherine's testimony forces medical professionals to confront systematic rather than individual explanations for widespread pharmaceutical dependence. Dr. Foster's latest research, now supported by the Society's resources and political influence, reveals that pharmaceutical companies have systematically suppressed internal studies documenting addiction risks while promoting external research that emphasizes safety and efficacy. Her analysis of industry documents obtained through legal discovery provides devastating evidence of deliberate deception rather than innocent medical error. The internal pharmaceutical documents reveal sophisticated understanding of addiction chemistry and deliberate marketing strategies designed to create childhood dependencies while concealing risks from parents and physicians. Company executives discuss customer retention and repeat business in terms that explicitly acknowledge addiction creation as business strategy rather than accidental side effect. Foster's documentation of industry knowledge about addiction risks provides legal foundation for criminal prosecution rather than civil litigation alone. Her evidence demonstrates that pharmaceutical companies possess detailed scientific understanding of harm while actively concealing risks through fraudulent marketing campaigns targeting desperate parents. The criminal implications of pharmaceutical deception create new legal avenues for challenging childhood medication practices through fraud prosecution rather than product liability alone. The Society's legal team begins developing criminal cases that could result in imprisonment for pharmaceutical executives rather than financial penalties that represent acceptable business costs. Elizabeth Hartwell's decision to pursue criminal charges against pharmaceutical executives reflects her recognition that civil litigation cannot provide adequate accountability for systematic harm that has destroyed thousands of families while generating enormous profits. Her willingness to seek imprisonment for leaders' industry demonstrates the escalating intensity of reform efforts. The pharmaceutical industry's response to criminal prosecution threats involves mobilizing political influence at the highest levels of British government, while launching sophisticated public relations campaigns designed to portray reform advocates as dangerous extremists, threatening medical progress and child welfare. Lord Pemberton's conflict between his wife's reform activism and his pharmaceutical investments reaches crisis intensity as criminal prosecutions threaten his business relationships, while Catherine's public testimony exposes his complicity in systematic child abuse through his political investment profit survival depends on choosing between commercial interests and family loyalty. Pemberton's decision to support meaningful pharmaceutical reform rather than protecting his investments represents a crucial political breakthrough that enables legislative action against childhood medication practices. His conversion from industry ally to reform supporter provides essential political credibility for comprehensive regulatory change. The parliamentary debates over pharmaceutical reform reveal the extensive political influence that industry interests have developed through decades of profitable operations without meaningful oversight. Reform advocates face sophisticated opposition from legislators whose careers depend on maintaining commercial relationships while appearing to support child welfare. The legislative battle involves complex negotiations over regulatory authority, enforcement mechanisms, and industry accountability that reflect fundamental conflicts between commercial interests and child protection. The outcome will determine whether British society develops effective safeguards against pharmaceutical exploitation or continues accepting systematic poisoning through commercially motivated medical practices. Sarah Whitmore's testimony before Parliament provides devastating personal evidence of pharmaceutical harm that transcends statistical arguments and theoretical debates. Her detailed account of William's pharmaceutical history and eventual death creates emotional impact that forces legislators to confront human consequences of their regulatory decisions. Sarah's transformation from desperate working-class mother into effective political advocate demonstrates the power of personal tragedy to create social change through organized political action. Her testimony represents thousands of similar stories that demand immediate regulatory response despite industry opposition and political resistance. The Parliamentary Committee's final recommendations reflect complex compromises between reform demands and industry interests that satisfy neither side while creating appearance of meaningful action. The proposed regulations include stronger labelling requirements, medical supervision mandates, and restricted sales procedures that fail to address fundamental problems of addiction creation and parental deception. Elizabeth's response to inadequate parliamentary action involves organising massive public demonstrations that attract tens of thousands of supporters from across Britain, while creating unprecedented pressure for comprehensive rather than cosmetic reform. The demonstrations reveal widespread public support for pharmaceutical accountability that transcends party politics and class divisions. The public response to pharmaceutical reform demonstrations creates new political dynamics that force government officials to choose between industry interests and electoral survival. The scale of public participation demonstrates that pharmaceutical accountability has become a defining political issue that cannot be resolved through traditional compromise strategies. Margaret Davies's coordination of simultaneous demonstrations in 17 cities creates nationwide pressure that overwhelms industry attempts to contain reform movements through local political influence. The coordinated action demonstrates organizational sophistication that rivals industry political operations while maintaining grassroots authenticity that resonates with public opinion. The demonstrations attract international attention that creates additional pressure for British pharmaceutical reform, while inspiring similar movements in other countries facing comparable childhood medication problems. The global dimension of pharmaceutical accountability creates new challenges for industry interests that have relied on national regulatory capture to maintain profitable practices. Dr. Foster's presentation at the International Medical Congress in Paris provides scientific credibility for pharmaceutical reform movements while exposing British childhood medication practices to international scrutiny. Her documentation of systematic harm creates professional embarrassment that forces British medical authorities to address pharmaceutical problems or face international condemnation. The international medical response to Foster's research creates professional pressure that transcends commercial influence while providing scientific legitimacy for reform efforts that industry interests cannot dismiss through traditional authority claims. The global medical community's recognition of pharmaceutical harm forces British physicians to choose between professional credibility and commercial relationships. Meanwhile, the human cost of childhood pharmaceutical dependence continues mounting, as young adults carrying medication histories prove incapable of normal social functioning while creating new categories of social problems that strain traditional institutions. Their chemical dependencies create cascading effects that influence crime rates, employment patterns, and family formation in ways that threaten social stability. The emergence of organized criminal enterprises serving pharmaceutical addiction markets creates new law enforcement challenges that reveal connections between childhood medication practices and adult criminal behavior. Police officials begin recognizing that pharmaceutical addiction represents a source of criminal activity rather than simply individual moral failure. Detective Inspector William Morrison of the Metropolitan Police documents increasing numbers of crimes committed by young adults whose pharmaceutical dependencies drive criminal behavior designed to obtain money or drugs necessary for continued chemical functioning. His reports provide law enforcement perspective on pharmaceutical harm that transcends individual addiction to encompass systematic threats to public safety. Morrison's investigation of pharmaceutical-related crime reveals sophisticated criminal networks that exploit childhood addiction while corrupting medical suppliers, professionals, and commercial through enormous profit opportunities. His findings demonstrate that childhood medication practices have created criminal markets that threaten social order while enriching both legitimate and illegitimate pharmaceutical suppliers. The law enforcement perspective on pharmaceutical addiction provides additional political support for reform efforts, while creating new urgency around regulatory action that addresses public safety concerns. Police testimony about pharmaceutical crime creates bipartisan support that transcends traditional political divisions, while providing compelling evidence for immediate legislative action. The convergence of maternal activism, medical research, criminal investigation, and international scrutiny creates unprecedented pressure for comprehensive pharmaceutical reform that addresses systematic rather than superficial aspects of childhood medication practices. The coalition of reform interests represents the most serious challenge to pharmaceutical authority in British history, while providing foundations for meaningful regulatory change. Elizabeth Hartwell's recognition that sustainable reform requires permanent institutional changes, rather than temporary political victories, leads her to establish educational programs that train medical professionals about pharmaceutical addiction, while creating ongoing oversight mechanisms that prevent future exploitation. Her long-term approach recognizes that protecting children requires cultural transformation alongside regulatory change. The Society's educational initiatives reach thousands of medical students who receive training about pharmaceutical addiction that their professors refuse to provide due to commercial relationships with industry interests. The alternative medical education creates new generations of physicians who understand pharmaceutical harm while possessing knowledge necessary for effective addiction treatment. Dr. Foster's appointment as the first professor of pharmaceutical addiction studies at the University of Edinburgh represents institutional recognition of childhood medication harm while providing academic foundation for ongoing research and education. Her position creates permanent opposition to industry influence while ensuring continued scientific scrutiny of pharmaceutical practices. The establishment of academic programs focused on pharmaceutical addiction creates intellectual infrastructure that supports ongoing reform efforts while providing scientific credibility that transcends political and commercial influences. The academic approach ensures that pharmaceutical accountability becomes embedded in professional education, rather than remaining dependent on activist organization. Sarah Whitmore's development of community support programs for families dealing with pharmaceutical addiction creates practical assistance that addresses immediate needs while building political support for continued reform efforts. Her approach recognizes that sustainable change requires helping individual families while challenging systematic practices that create ongoing harm. The community programs provide withdrawal assistance, family counseling, and economic support that enable families to break pharmaceutical dependencies while maintaining household stability. The practical services demonstrate alternatives to pharmaceutical child management, while creating evidence of successful recovery that challenges industry claims about addiction inevitability. Margaret Davies's coordination of community programs across Wales creates regional networks that provide mutual support while maintaining political pressure for continued reform. Her organising strategy combines immediate assistance with long-term advocacy in ways that sustain movement momentum while addressing practical needs. The success of community-based pharmaceutical addiction programs provides evidence that childhood medication dependencies can be successfully addressed through comprehensive support services that combine medical supervision with economic assistance and family counselling. The programs demonstrate alternatives to continued medication while creating models for nationwide expansion. Catherine Pemberton's financial support for community programs enables expansion into middle-class neighbourhoods that previously lacked resources for addressing pharmaceutical addiction. Her funding creates comprehensive services that transcend economic boundaries, while demonstrating universal applicability of addiction recovery programs. The expansion of pharmaceutical addiction services into middle-class communities reveals the widespread nature of childhood medication problems while creating political support that transcends class divisions. The universal availability of recovery services demonstrates that pharmaceutical accountability represents comprehensive social reform rather than working-class advocacy alone. The pharmaceutical industry's response to successful addiction recovery programs involves sophisticated campaigns designed to discredit treatment effectiveness while promoting continued medication as evidence-based medical practice. Their opposition to recovery services reveals industry recognition that successful alternatives threaten profitable childhood medication markets. Industry attacks on addiction recovery programs focus on safety concerns and withdrawal risks, while ignoring successful treatment outcomes that demonstrate effective alternatives to continued pharmaceutical dependence. The industry strategy involves exploiting parental fears about withdrawal complications, while concealing evidence of successful recovery through comprehensive support services. Doctor of Recovery. Foster's documentation program outcomes provide scientific evidence that challenges industry claims about withdrawal dangers while demonstrating successful treatment of childhood pharmaceutical addiction. Her research creates medical legitimacy for recovery approaches while exposing industry deception about treatment alternatives. The success of pharmaceutical addiction recovery programs creates new political dynamics that force government officials to choose between supporting effective treatment services, maintaining regulatory or frameworks that protect industry interests. The evidence of successful recovery eliminates excuses for continued acceptance of childhood pharmaceutical dependence. Elizabeth's testimony about recovery program success provides compelling evidence that childhood pharmaceutical addiction represents treatable medical condition rather than permanent dependence requiring lifelong chemical management. Her documentation of successful cases destroys industry arguments about addiction inevitability while demonstrating practical alternatives to continued medication. The combination of successful treatment programs, scientific research, criminal investigation, and international scrutiny creates irresistible pressure for comprehensive pharmaceutical reform that addresses systematic exploitation while providing effective treatment for existing addiction problems. The convergence of evidence and advocacy represents the culmination of decades of reform efforts that began with individual maternal grief, but evolved into comprehensive social movement. The pharmaceutical accountability movement's success in achieving meaningful regulatory change, while establishing permanent institutions for education, treatment, and oversight, represents one of the most significant public health victories in Victorian Britain. The mothers who transformed personal tragedy into social reform have created lasting protections that prevent future generations from experiencing systematic pharmaceutical exploitation. Their legacy demonstrates that protecting vulnerable populations requires sustained political action combined with practical alternatives that address immediate needs while challenging systematic practices that create ongoing harm. The courage of mothers like Elizabeth Hartwell, Sarah Whitmore, and Margaret Davies in confronting powerful commercial interests while grieving their own losses provides inspiration for future generations facing similar challenges from industries that prioritize profits over human welfare. The victory over childhood pharmaceutical exploitation reminds us that the most dangerous threats to children often come disguised as beneficial solutions endorsed by trusted authorities, and that protecting future generations requires constant vigilance against commercial interests that exploit parental desperation while concealing systematic harm behind medical authority and scientific credibility. As the 1880s draw to a close, the transformed landscape of childhood pharmaceutical regulation reflects the power of organized maternal activism to challenge even the most entrenched commercial interests when motivated by love for children and sustained through collective determination to prevent future suffering. The addicted mothers and poisoned children of Victorian England have finally found their voices, and their demands for accountability echo across generations, as enduring testament to the possibility of meaningful social change through persistent advocacy and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their vulnerability for profit. The battle for pharmaceutical accountability reaches its climax in the winter of 1887, when Parliament finally passes the Infant Protection Act, the most comprehensive pharmaceutical reform legislation in British history. But victory comes at a devastating personal cost for the women who fought so relentlessly for change. Elizabeth Hartwell collapses during the celebration outside Parliament, her body finally succumbing to years of relentless advocacy that consumed her health as thoroughly as morphine consumed her son. At 53, she appears decades older, her hair white, her frame completely gaunt from meals skipped to attend meetings and demonstrations across the country. As Elizabeth lies in her bed at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, surrounded by the women who became her sisters in grief and battle, she reflects on the price of their victory. The Infant Protection Act mandates medical supervision for all childhood pharmaceutical administration, establishes treatment centres for addiction recovery, and creates criminal penalties for manufacturers who conceal addiction risks from consumers. But the legislation comes too late for Thomas, for William Whitmore, for Mary Blackwood, for the thousands of children whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of pharmaceutical profits. Their deaths purchased protection for future generations, but the mothers who survived them carry scars that no legislative victory can heal. Dr. Foster, now recognised as Britain's leading authority on pharmaceutical addiction, visits Elizabeth regularly during her final weeks. Their conversations reveal the profound transformation that both women underwent through their struggle against an industry that seemed invincible until mothers proved otherwise. Foster describes the moment she first recognized the connection between infant remedies and adolescent behavioral problems, how her medical training fought against evidence that implicated respected colleagues and trusted treatments. Her journey from pharmaceutical supporter to reform leader required abandoning everything she believed about medical authority and commercial trustworthiness. Elizabeth's response reveals, but equally profound, the different transformation experienced by mothers who discovered care had poisoned that their loving evolution won their children. Her from grateful consumer of pharmaceutical promises to fierce opponent of commercial deception required confronting the reality that trusted authorities had manipulated her maternal instincts to create profit from suffering. Their final conversations illuminate the broader implications of pharmaceutical accountability beyond immediate regulatory change. The struggle revealed fundamental problems with medical authority that prioritizes commercial relationships over patient welfare, regulatory systems that protect industry interests rather than public health, and social structures that exploit parental desperation while blaming families for systematic failures. Margaret Davies arrives from Wales carrying news that demonstrates the immediate impact of reform legislation. The first pharmaceutical addiction treatment centre in Cardiff has successfully helped 47 families break childhood medication dependencies that seemed permanent and hopeless just months earlier. Margaret's description of recovery processes reveals the sophisticated support systems required to address pharmaceutical addiction created through years of medical recommendation. Successful treatment combines gradual medication reduction with family counselling, economic assistance, and community support that addresses the complex needs created by systematic chemical dependence. The Cardiff Centre's success stories provide hope that transforms Elizabeth's final weeks from bitter reflection on personal loss into celebration of future possibilities. 8-year-old Jenny Morrison, whose withdrawal from morphine-based preparations seemed impossible due to violent seizures, now attends school regularly without any pharmaceutical assistance. 15-year-old Peter Williams, whose addiction began before birth through his mother's pregnancy medication, has found employment at a local bakery where his employer understands his recovery process and provides flexibility during difficult days. His success demonstrates that even prenatal pharmaceutical addiction can be overcome through comprehensive treatment and community support. The recovery stories reveal how completely childhood pharmaceutical dependence had distorted normal human development. Children who successfully withdraw from morphine-based preparations experience emotions, sensations, and relationships that they never knew existed during their medicated years. Jenny Morrison's mother describes watching her daughter experience genuine laughter for the first time at age 8, as pharmaceutical sedation had suppressed authentic emotional expression throughout her early childhood. The recovery process involved not just chemical withdrawal, but learning basic human responses that medication had prevented from developing naturally. Peter Williams's experience of unmediated sensory input proved overwhelming initially, as colours appeared brighter, sounds seemed louder, and physical sensations felt more intense than anything he had experienced during his pharmaceutical dependence. His recovery required learning to process environmental stimuli without chemical buffering that had mediated all sensory input since before birth. Elizabeth's recognition that successful recovery involves discovering authentic rehumanity provides profound satisfaction that transcends personal grief. The children who overcome pharmaceutical addiction demonstrate possibilities that industry experts claimed were impossible, proving that human resilience can triumph over commercial manipulation when supported through comprehensive treatment programs. Sarah Whitmore's visit brings additional evidence of recovery success that validates years of struggle against seemingly impossible odds. Her youngest daughter, born after Sarah stopped using pregnancy medication, displays natural emotional regulation and behavioral flexibility that starkly contrasts with her older siblings' pharmaceutical dependence. The comparison between medicated and unmedicated children in the same family provides compelling evidence of pharmaceutical harm that transcends statistical arguments. Sarah's natural daughter exhibits curiosity, creativity, and emotional resilience that her morphine-dependent siblings never developed during their chemical childhood. Sarah's description of natural parenting without pharmaceutical assistance reveals skills and instincts that she had forgotten during years of chemical child management. Learning to comfort crying infants through physical contact rather than medication, addressing behavioral challenges through consistency rather than chemical suppression, and managing family stress through mutual support rather than pharmaceutical intervention required rediscovering maternal capabilities that commercial marketing had convinced her were inadequate. The recovery of parenting skills provides additional, authentic validation reform efforts, while for demonstrating practical alternatives to pharmaceutical child management. Sarah's experience proves that mothers possess natural capabilities for addressing childhood challenges when freed from commercial messages that promote chemical solutions over human relationships. Dr. Foster's documentation of natural parenting recovery creates scientific evidence supporting legislative reforms while providing practical guidance for families transitants. Her research demonstrating away from pharmaceutical dependence that successful child rearing predated commercial medication, while remaining fully achievable when parents receive appropriate support and encouragement. Elizabeth's final public appearance occurs at the grand opening of the London Treatment Centre for Childhood Pharmaceutical Addiction, where she delivers a speech that becomes her legacy statement to future generations. Her words provide inspiration and warning that pharmaceutical accountability requires permanent vigilance rather than temporary victory. Elizabeth's speech emphasizes that commercial interests will continuously seek new opportunities to exploit parental desperation through products that promise easy solutions to complex challenges. Her warning about pharmaceutical vigilance proves prophetic, as industry interests begin developing new marketing strategies designed to circumvent reform legislation while maintaining profitable childhood chemical management. The pharmaceutical industry's response to regulatory change involves reformulating products to comply with technical requirements while maintaining addiction through alternative potential chemical combinations. Their adaptation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both regulatory frameworks and addiction chemistry that enables continued exploitation through legal compliance. New products marketed as pharmaceutical alternatives combine caffeine, alcohol, and various plant-based stimulants in preparations that produce behavioral effects similar to morphine while avoiding specific regulatory restrictions. The reformulated remedies maintain commercial viability while appearing to address legislative concerns about childhood addiction. Dr. Foster's analysis of reformulated products reveals industry determination to preserve childhood medication markets through chemical innovation that exploits regulatory loopholes. Her research demonstrates that meaningful pharmaceutical accountability requires ongoing scientific scrutiny rather than single legislative victories that can be circumvented through product development. The emergence of reformulated pharmaceutical products creates new challenges for recovery programs that must address different chemical dependencies while maintaining treatment effectiveness. The industry's adaptive strategies require corresponding evolution in treatment approaches that can address multiple substance dependencies created through commercial innovation. Margaret Davies coordinates treatment center responses to reformulated pharmaceutical products through information-sharing networks that enable rapid identification of new addiction risks. Her organizing approach recognizes that sustainable reform requires permanent infrastructure for monitoring commercial practices, rather than assuming that single legislative victories provide lasting protection. The treatment center networks demonstrate institutional learning that adapts to industry strategies while maintaining recovery effectiveness across different chemical dependencies. Their success provides evidence that comprehensive treatment approaches can address evolving pharmaceutical threats when supported through adequate resources and professional coordination. Elizabeth's death in March 1888 marks the end of an era in pharmaceutical reform, while inspiring renewed commitment to permanent vigilance against commercial exploitation. Her funeral attracts thousands of mourners whose presence demonstrates the profound social impact of maternal activism that transformed personal tragedy into lasting institutional change. The funeral procession through London streets passes locations that mark crucial moments in pharmaceutical reform history. The route includes the Anglo-American Drug Company headquarters, where Elizabeth first confronted industry executives about Thomas's death, the parliamentary buildings, where she testified about systematic pharmaceutical harm, and the treatment centres that represent her lasting legacy to future generations. Sarah Whitmore's eulogy captures Elizabeth's transformation from desperate mother seeking chemical solutions for childhood challenges into fierce advocate whose determination overcame seemingly impossible obstacles through sustained political action. Her tribute emphasizes Elizabeth's recognition that protecting children requires confronting powerful interests that profit from family suffering. Margaret Davies's remarks focus on Elizabeth's ability to create unity among women whose different social backgrounds initially seemed to preclude cooperation. Her organizing genius lay in recognizing shared maternal experiences that transcended class divisions while building coalitions powerful enough to challenge entrenched commercial and political interests. Dr. Foster's scientific tribute describes Elizabeth's intuitive understanding of pharmaceutical addiction that preceded formal medical recognition, while providing crucial evidence for research that established addiction treatment as a legitimate medical specialty. Her collaboration with medical professionals demonstrated how maternal knowledge could enhance, rather than conflict, with scientific investigation. Catherine Pemberton's aristocratic perspective on Elizabeth's achievement emphasizes her courage in challenging medical authority that commanded automatic social deference. Her willingness to question respected physicians and pharmaceutical companies required abandoning assumptions about institutional trustworthiness that defined upper-class social relationships. The diverse perspectives on Elizabeth's legacy demonstrate how pharmaceutical reform created unprecedented cooperation across social boundaries while establishing new models for citizen activism that challenged traditional deference to commercial and medical authority. Her example inspired future generations of advocates who understood that protecting vulnerable populations requires persistent organization rather than individual complaint. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death creates concerns about movement sustainability without her charismatic leadership and organizational skills. Reform advocates worry that pharmaceutical interests will exploit leadership transition to reverse legislative gains, while undermining treatment programs that depend on continued political support. Sarah's assumption of movement leadership demonstrates institutional strengthens individual that transpersonalities reform while maintaining momentum through collective commitment to pharmaceutical accountability. Her transition from follower to leader illustrates how sustained political action creates multiple capable advocates, rather than dependence on single charismatic figures. The movement's survival during leadership transition provides evidence of institutional maturity that can withstand industry attempts at reversal while maintaining pressure for continued reform. The organizational structure that Elizabeth created enables continued advocacy without losing effectiveness or political influence during personnel changes. Margaret's coordination of regional activities ensures that pharmaceutical reform maintains national scope rather than becoming concentrated in London political circles. Her approach recognizes that sustainable change requires grassroots organization that can resist industry influence while providing ongoing support for treatment programs and regulatory enforcement. The treatment centers, established during Elizabeth's lifetime, demonstrate practical success that validates reform efforts while providing ongoing evidence for continued legislative support. Their effectiveness in addressing childhood pharmaceutical addiction creates political momentum that transcends individual leadership changes while establishing pharmaceutical accountability as permanent policy priority. Dr. Foster's research program receives permanent university funding that ensures continued scientific investigation of pharmaceutical practices regardless of political changes or industry opposition. Her academic position creates institutional independence that enables ongoing scrutiny of commercial practices while training future medical professionals about addiction risks and treatment approaches. The combination of political organization, treatment infrastructure, and scientific research creates comprehensive reform framework that can address emerging pharmaceutical threats while maintaining accountability for existing practices. The institutional legacy represents Elizabeth's greatest achievement in creating permanent protections rather than temporary political victories. The pharmaceutical industry's recognition that reform efforts have created lasting institutional opposition leads to strategic changes that emphasize international expansion rather than domestic market recovery. Their shift toward overseas marketing demonstrates industry acknowledgement that British regulatory environment has become permanently hostile to exploitative childhood medication practices. The international expansion of pharmaceutical marketing creates new challenges for reform movements that must coordinate across national boundaries while addressing different regulatory frameworks and cultural contexts. The global dimension of pharmaceutical accountability requires international cooperation that transcends domestic political organization. Elizabeth's influence on international pharmaceutical reform becomes apparent through correspondence with mothers in Germany, France, and America who seek guidance for addressing childhood medication problems in their own countries. Her legacy extends beyond British boundaries, while inspiring global movements for pharmaceutical accountability. The international dimension of pharmaceutical reform validates Elizabeth's recognition that commercial exploitation of parental desperation represents systematic rather than isolated phenomenon, requiring comprehensive rather than local solutions. Her vision of global pharmaceutical accountability proves prophetic as international evidence confirms widespread childhood medication problems. Sarah's coordination with international reform advocates creates global networks that share information about industry practices while developing coordinated responses to pharmaceutical marketing that exploits regulatory differences between countries. The international approach recognizes that commercial interests operate globally while requiring corresponding cooperation among reform movements. The emergence of international pharmaceutical accountability demonstrates how maternal activism can transcend national boundaries while creating universal protection for children against commercial exploitation. Elizabeth's legacy inspires global movements that prove her recognition that pharmaceutical accountability represents fundamental human rights issue rather than local political concern. Margaret's documentation of successful treatment outcomes creates scientific evidence that supports international reform efforts, while demonstrating practical alternatives to pharmaceutical child management across different cultural contexts. Her research proves that childhood pharmaceutical addiction represents universal rather than culturally specific phenomenon requiring similar treatment approaches. The global expansion of pharmaceutical reform validates Elizabeth's sacrifice while ensuring that her death contributed to worldwide protection for children rather than limited domestic change. Her legacy demonstrates how individual courage can inspire international movements that create lasting protection against commercial exploitation of parental love. Dr. Foster's appointment to the International Medical Commission on Childhood Pharmaceutical Addiction represents institutional recognition that reform efforts have achieved scientific legitimacy while creating permanent oversight of commercial practices. Her international ensures role continued scrutiny of industry behavior while establishing pharmaceutical accountability as recognized medical specialty. The Commission's establishment creates permanent international infrastructure for monitoring pharmaceutical practices while coordinating regulatory responses across national boundaries. The institutional framework represents culmination of reform efforts that began with individual maternal grief but achieved international recognition and permanent protection. Catherine's financial support for international treatment centres enables global expansion of recovery services, while demonstrating that pharmaceutical accountability transcends national interests. Her funding creates comprehensive international infrastructure that can address childhood pharmaceutical addiction, regardless of economic or political circumstances in different countries. The International Treatment Network validates Elizabeth's vision of comprehensive pharmaceutical reform, while proving that her sacrifice contributed to global rather than local change. The worldwide impact demonstrates how individual courage can inspire movements that transcend original circumstances, while creating universal protection for vulnerable populations. As the 1880s conclude, the transformation of pharmaceutical regulation from industry self-interest to comprehensive accountability represents one of the most significant public health victories in modern history. The mothers who challenged seemingly impossible odds through sustained political action have created lasting institutional protection that ensures their children's sacrifice was not in vain. Elizabeth Hartwell's legacy lives on through treatment centres that restore authentic childhood to thousands of children, regulatory frameworks that prevent future exploitation, and international networks that protect children worldwide from commercial manipulation of parental desperation. Her transformation from desperate mother to fierce advocate demonstrates how personal tragedy can inspire social change that transcends individual circumstances while creating lasting protection for future generations. The victory over childhood pharmaceutical exploitation proves that organized citizen action can challenge even the most powerful commercial interests when motivated by love for children and sustained through collective determination to prevent future suffering. The courage of mothers who confronted medical authority and commercial power while grieving their own losses provides enduring inspiration for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges from industries that prioritize profits over human welfare. Their success reminds future generations that protecting vulnerable populations requires permanent vigilance against commercial exploitation, disguised as beneficial solutions, and that the most dangerous threats to children often come from trusted authorities whose credibility conceals systematic harm. The addicted mothers and poisoned children of Victorian England have finally found justice, and their demands for accountability echo across time as testament to the power of maternal love to overcome any obstacle in defense of childhood innocence. The pharmaceutical accountability movement's triumph demonstrates that no commercial interest, regardless of wealth or political influence, can ultimately withstand the determined opposition of parents who recognize threats to their children's welfare. Elizabeth Hartwell and her sisters in struggle have proven that love for children, when organized and sustained through collective action, represents the most powerful force for social change in human history. The story of Victorian England's morphine mothers and their poisoned children stands as one of history's most devastating examples of how commercial interests can exploit parental love while medical authority provides cover for systematic harm. What began with Friedrich Serturner's innocent discovery in 1805 evolved into a pharmaceutical catastrophe that destroyed countless families while generating enormous profits for companies that understood exactly what they were creating. Sarah Whitmore, Elizabeth Hartwell, Emma Blackwood, and thousands of mothers like them were not villains in this tragedy. They were victims of a system designed to transform their deepest maternal instincts into mechanisms of harm. Their love for their children became the very weapon used against them by industries that marketed addiction as medical progress while concealing the devastating long-term consequences of their products. The courage of mothers like Elizabeth Hartwell, who transformed personal grief into political action, ultimately created the institutional protections that prevent modern families from experiencing similar exploitation. Their sacrifice established treatment centers, regulatory frameworks, and international oversight that ensure pharmaceutical companies can never again target infants with addictive substances while deceiving desperate parents about the risks. But their victory came at an unimaginable cost. Thomas Hartwell, William Whitmore, Mary Blackwood, and thousands of other children paid the ultimate price for society's failure to question pharmaceutical marketing claims backed by medical authority. Their deaths purchased protection for future generations, but the mothers who survived them carried scars that no legislative victory could heal. The legacy of Victorian England's pharmaceutical catastrophe serves as an eternal warning that the most dangerous threats to children often come disguised as helpful solutions endorsed by trusted authorities. It reminds us that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance against commercial interests that prioritize profits over human welfare, and that even the most powerful industries cannot ultimately withstand the determined opposition of parents who recognize genuine threats to their children's welfare. Elizabeth Hartwell's final words at the London Treatment Centre opening captured the eternal truth that emerged from this tragedy. Pharmaceutical accountability requires permanent vigilance rather than temporary victory. Her warning proved prophetic, as commercial interests continuously seek new opportunities to exploit parental desperation through products that promise easy solutions to complex challenges. The transformation of these grieving mothers into fierce advocates demonstrates that love for children, when organized and sustained through collective action, represents the most powerful force for social change in human history. Their triumph over seemingly impossible odds proves that no commercial interest, regardless of wealth or political influence, can ultimately prevail against parents who understand their fundamental duty to protect childhood innocence from those who would exploit it for profit.